Hello everyone, I am MANO Scaling, and I am here to help you today. I know you use this video to fall asleep, so before that, please like the video and subscribe to the channel, and also tell me where you are from and what time you are watching. Now get comfortable and relax. My name is Emily Hall, and I am 32 years old. This happened in the Mark Twain National Forest, Missouri 3 years ago, during what was supposed to be a rejuvenating solo hiking trip. I've replayed the events in my mind countless times, trying to make sense of what I experienced, but even now, I'm not sure if what I encountered was natural, supernatural, or a manifestation of my own fracturing psyche. I suppose I should start at the beginning. After my fiancé, Daniel, called off our wedding just 2 months before the date, my life felt like it was collapsing. 3 years together ended with a conversation that lasted less than 30 minutes in our favorite coffee shop. Neutral ground, he'd called it. "I can't do this anymore, Em," he'd said, not quite meeting my eyes. "I thought I could, but I can't. I'm sorry." No explanation beyond a vague declaration that he needed to find himself. I later discovered through mutual friends that finding himself involved finding my yoga instructor, with whom he'd been having an affair for months. The betrayal hollowed me out. I stopped sleeping, barely ate, and threw myself into work at the architectural firm where I was already known for putting in long hours. Concerned coworkers watched me transform from a vibrant social person into a ghost that haunted the office late into the night. It was my friend Lisa who finally intervened, bursting into my apartment one Friday evening with determination written across her face. "Enough," she declared, confiscating my work laptop. "You're destroying yourself. You need to disconnect completely. No work, no social media, no reminders of Daniel. Just you and nature." Lisa was an avid backpacker, and the idea of escaping into wilderness held immediate appeal. She helped me plan a 5-day solo trek through the Mark Twain National Forest, insisted on equipping me with proper gear. "Your REI credit card is about to hate you," and made me promise to check in with her periodically via satellite phone. Looking back, I should have recognized the warnings. The park ranger's hesitation when I mentioned camping near Greer Spring, the odd silence that fell over the small general store in Winona when I asked for directions to the Devil's Backbone Trail. But I was too caught up in my own need to escape. From the city, from my broken engagement, from myself. "You sure you want to camp that far out, ma'am?" the ranger had asked, his weathered face creasing with concern. "Lots of folks stick to the established campgrounds this time of year." "I need the solitude," I'd replied with more conviction than I felt. "I've done plenty of solo camping before." He'd nodded slowly, eyes lingering on my expensive hiking boots and brand new backpack. I could almost hear his thoughts. City girl playing wilderness explorer. "Just stay on the marked trails," he finally said, stamping my permit. "And if you hear anything strange at night, well, just remember sound carries funny out there." I should have asked what he meant by strange. I should have pressed for details. Instead, I just smiled, thanked him, and headed out, eager to prove myself capable. The first day was uneventful. The October air was crisp but not uncomfortably cold, and the forest was ablaze with fall colors, vibrant reds and golds painted across the rolling Ozark landscape. I hiked about 8 miles, my muscles pleasantly aching as I set up camp in a small clearing about a half-mile off the main trail. I'd chosen a spot near a babbling creek, the sound of running water both practical and soothing. As darkness fell, I built a small fire, heated my dehydrated pasta meal, and watched the stars appear overhead, vivid and numerous in a way they never were in St. Louis. The isolation I'd craved wrapped around me like a blanket, and for the first time in months, I felt my shoulders relax, the constant tension in my chest easing. That peace lasted exactly until 2:37 a.m., when I jolted awake, heart hammering against my ribs. Something had woken me. A sound? A dream? I lay perfectly still in my tent, listening. The forest had gone unnaturally quiet. No insects chirping, no nightbirds calling, not even the rustle of leaves in the breeze. Just silence. Complete, smothering silence. Then I heard it. A thin, reedy whistling. Not the wind, not an animal. It sounded almost melodic, like someone whistling a tune just at the edge of hearing. I told myself it was nothing. Maybe a fellow hiker camping nearby, but deep down, I knew no one else was supposed to be in this section of the forest. I'd specifically chosen this route for its isolation. The whistling stopped abruptly, replaced by what sounded like voices murmuring just outside my tent, too low to make out words but distinctly human in cadence. I fumbled for my flashlight, hands shaking, and called out, "Hello? Is someone there?" The murmuring ceased instantly. Sweat beaded along my hairline despite the chill. I unzipped my tent slowly, heart thudding so loudly I was sure it could be heard for miles. The clearing was empty, bathed in pale moonlight. My fire had died to embers hours ago, casting a faint red glow but no real light. "Hello?" I called again, my voice sounding small and fragile in the vast stillness. Nothing answered except a sudden gust of wind that sent dead leaves skittering across the ground. I told myself I'd been dreaming, that the stress of the past few months had followed me here. I zipped the tent closed and tried to fall back asleep, flashlight clutched in my hand like a talisman. Just as exhaustion began to pull me under, the whistling started again, closer this time, and I could almost recognize the tune. Something old, something that reminded me of childhood, of something forbidden. I didn't sleep again that night. Dawn broke reluctantly through a heavy mist that clung to the forest floor. Everything looked different, ghostly and unfamiliar. I packed quickly, eager to move, to shake off the night's unease. I told myself that today would be better, that I just needed to get deeper into the wilderness, where human intrusions would be even less likely. I followed the trail toward 11 Point River, planning to camp near there for my second night. The map showed several small lakes and springs in that area, perfect for replenishing my water supply. The hiking was more difficult than the previous day, steeper inclines, rougher terrain. By midday, I'd worked up a good sweat despite the cool temperature, and my earlier fears seemed silly in the clarity of daylight. Around noon, I stopped at a small lookout point to eat lunch and take in the view. The mist had burned off, revealing miles of undulating forest. As I sat munching my energy bar, movement in the trees below caught my eye. A flash of pale color that didn't belong among the autumn foliage. I squinted, trying to get a better look. A person? An animal? Whatever it was had disappeared, but I couldn't shake the feeling I was being watched. The hair on the back of my neck stood up, and suddenly the vastness of the forest seemed less like freedom and more like exposure. As I packed up to continue hiking, I heard a sharp crack, like a branch breaking underfoot, from the woods behind me. I spun around, pulse quickening. "Hello?" I called. "Is someone there?" No answer, but the feeling of eyes on me intensified. I shouldered my pack and set off at a quicker pace than before, telling myself I was being paranoid. The forest was full of wildlife, deer, foxes, the occasional black bear. Nothing to worry about. The trail grew narrower as it wound through a dense section of pine trees, their needled branches creating a canopy that blocked much of the sunlight. The temperature seemed to drop several degrees, and the pleasant forest scents gave way to something musty and dank. I checked my map and GPS to make sure I was still on the right path. According to my devices, I was following the Devil's Backbone trail perfectly, but something felt wrong. The trail markers seemed faded, almost obscured in places, and twice I had to backtrack after nearly losing my way. By late afternoon, fatigue was setting in. According to my calculations, I should have reached the junction leading to 11 Point River hours ago, but the trail just kept winding through increasingly unfamiliar terrain. My GPS signal was becoming erratic, the screen occasionally glitching with static before clearing again. I was considering setting up camp early when I spotted a small cabin through the trees, weathered gray wood almost invisible against the forest backdrop. It wasn't marked on my map, which was strange for a structure this size, but I felt a surge of relief at the sight of it. Maybe whoever lived there could confirm I was heading in the right direction. As I approached, however, my steps slowed. Something was off about the cabin. No smoke from the chimney, no vehicle parked nearby, no sign of habitation at all except a rocking chair on the small porch, moving gently back and forth as if someone had just left it. "Hello?" I called, stopping at the edge of the small clearing surrounding the structure. "Anyone home?" The rocking chair kept its gentle rhythm. No other sound or movement came from the cabin. I should have turned back right then. Everything in me was screaming to return to the trail, to get as far from this place as possible. But exhaustion and growing confusion about my location won out. I needed information, and this cabin might contain maps or other clues about where I was. I approached slowly, calling out again as I climbed the 2 weathered steps to the porch. The rocking chair stopped moving the moment my foot touched the first step, so suddenly it seemed unnatural. Up close, I could see how old it was. The wood cracked and silvered with age, mysterious stains darkening the seat and armrests. The cabin door was slightly ajar, darkness visible through the crack. I knocked tentatively, then with more force when no answer came. "Hello? I'm sorry to intrude, but I think I'm lost. Could you help me with directions?" The door swung inward at my touch, hinges protesting with a low groan. The smell hit me first, musty and organic, like old leaves and wet earth, but with an underlying sweetness that made my stomach turn. I stood in the doorway, waiting for my eyes to adjust to the dimness. "Hello?" I called again, softer now. The cabin consisted of a single room, sparsely furnished with a rough-hewn table, a cast-iron stove, and a narrow bed pushed against the far wall. Everything was covered in a fine layer of dust, undisturbed for what looked like years except for a set of footprints leading from the door to the table and back. Footprints too small to be an adult's, the size of a child's bare feet. On the table sat a collection of objects that made no sense together. A tarnished silver hand mirror, face down, a child's doll with button eyes and a stitched mouth, dressed in what looked like scraps of actual clothing, a mason jar filled with what I first thought were unusually large marbles, but as I moved closer, revealed themselves to be glass eyes of different colors, and, most disturbingly, a leather-bound book with no title, open to a page filled with handwriting so cramped and chaotic it was nearly illegible. Curiosity overcoming my unease, I leaned closer to examine the book without touching it. The writing appeared to be journal entries, but the language wasn't entirely English. Words and phrases I recognized interspersed with others that seemed to be a mix of French and something else entirely. One phrase was repeated throughout the visible pages. "Elle attend dans les bois. Elle a toujours faim." My high school French was rusty, but I understood enough. "She waits in the woods. She is always hungry." A soft thud from outside made me jump. I turned toward the door, expecting to see someone there, but it remained open to the empty porch. The rocking chair was moving again, faster now, as if occupied by an agitated sitter. My skin crawled with sudden, intense fear. I backed away from the table, nearly tripping over my own feet in my haste to leave. As I reached the door, the rocking chair stopped abruptly again. In the new silence, I heard it distinctly, a child's giggle seeming to come from just behind me. I ran, out the door, down the steps, across the clearing, not stopping until I reached the tree line where the trail continued. Only then did I look back, gasping for breath, heart hammering painfully in my chest. The cabin was gone. Where it had stood just moments before was nothing but unbroken forest, ancient trees and undergrowth with no sign a structure had ever existed there. I blinked hard, convinced my eyes were playing tricks on me. But no matter how long I stared, the cabin did not reappear. What reappeared, however, was the tune. That same whistling I'd heard the night before, now coming from deep within the forest to my right, away from the trail. It sounded clearer now, and with a jolt of recognition that sent ice through my veins, I identified it. Ring around the rosy, that nursery rhyme with its dark origins that every child knows. The sun was getting low on the horizon. I needed to make camp soon, but the thought of spending another night in these woods filled me with dread. I checked my GPS again. It showed me miles from where I thought I was, in a section of the forest that didn't even appear on my paper map. According to the device, I had somehow veered far off the Devil's Backbone Trail into an area with no marked paths at all. That was impossible. I'd followed the trail markers religiously all day. I tried calling for help on my satellite phone, but got nothing but static and strange, garbled voices that didn't respond to my increasingly panicked questions. The battery, which had been at 80% that morning, now showed just 15% despite the solar charger I'd been using throughout the day. With no other options, I decided to set up camp and try to retrace my steps in the morning. I found a small clearing that offered decent visibility in all directions and began unpacking my tent with trembling hands. That's when I noticed the symbols. They were carved into the trees surrounding the clearing, crude pictographs that looked like stick figures with elongated limbs and misshapen heads. Some were simple, others elaborate with spiraling patterns around them. All had been carved directly into the bark, the exposed wood darkened as if burned. I froze, tent poles clutched in my hands like weapons. These carvings were fresh, the exposed wood still light-colored in places, not yet weathered. Someone had made these recently. I was backing away, preparing to flee despite the fading light, when I heard a branch snap behind me. I whirled around, brandishing a tent pole, and found myself face to face with an old woman. She seemed to have materialized from nowhere. One moment the forest behind me was empty. The next, she stood barely 10 feet away. She was tiny, barely 5 feet tall, with a face so deeply lined it resembled crumpled paper. Her clothes were oddly old-fashioned, a long, dark dress with a stained apron, heavy boots caked with mud, and a knitted shawl pulled tight around bony shoulders. Her white hair hung in a long braid down her back, incongruously thick and lustrous compared to her withered appearance. But it was her eyes that held me rooted to the spot, pale blue, almost colorless, with a clarity and sharpness that seemed impossible in such an ancient face. "You're lost," she said. Not a question. Her voice was surprisingly rich and smooth, at odds with her fragile appearance. I nodded, unable to find my voice. "These woods can confuse a person," she continued, looking around as if seeing something I couldn't. "Especially when you bring trouble with you." I don't understand," I managed. "I was following the marked trail. I should be near 11 Point River, but my GPS shows me miles away." The old woman made a dismissive sound. "Those gadgets are useless here. The forest doesn't like them." Under normal circumstances, I would have dismissed such a statement as superstitious nonsense. But after what I'd experienced already, I wasn't feeling particularly rational. "Do you live nearby?" I asked, thinking of the vanished cabin. "Could you help me find my way back to the main trail?" She studied me with those unsettling, pale eyes. "I've lived here all my life, longer than the trails have existed." She paused, head tilting as if listening to something. "What's your name? Girl?" Every instinct warned against answering, but I was desperate for help. "Emily," I said. "Emily Hall." The woman's expression didn't change, but something shifted in her eyes. A calculation, an assessment. "You can call me Mrs. Greer," she said after a moment. "And yes, I can help you, but not tonight. It's too late to be wandering these woods." She gestured to the clearing. "Set up your tent. Build a fire, a big one. Don't leave its light during the night, no matter what you hear." "What might I hear?" I asked, my mouth dry. Mrs. Greer looked away toward the deepening shadows between the trees. "The forest speaks at night. Not all of its voices mean well." "Are there other people out here?" Her gaze snapped back to me, suddenly fierce. "Not people. Not anymore." She reached into her apron pocket and withdrew something, holding it out to me. "Take this. Keep it close until morning." It was a small bundle of dried herbs bound with red thread, giving off a sharp, astringent scent that made my eyes water. "What is it?" I asked, accepting it reluctantly. "Protection," she said simply. Then, with surprising efficiency for someone her age, she gathered fallen branches and arranged them in a circle around where my tent would stand. "Build your fire here. Don't let it die before dawn." Before I could ask any more questions, she turned and walked away, disappearing between the trees with unnatural quickness. I called after her, but received no answer except distant whistling, that same eerie tune from before. Night was falling rapidly now. Whatever my misgivings about this place, I had no choice but to follow Mrs. Greer's advice. I set up my tent with record speed and built a fire inside the circle of branches she'd created. As darkness settled completely over the forest, I fed the flames with trembling hands, the bundle of herbs clutched tightly in my pocket. The fire cast dancing shadows against the surrounding trees, making the carved symbols seem to move and writhe. I tried not to look at them, focusing instead on the flames, but my eyes were drawn repeatedly to their disturbing forms. For hours, nothing happened. The night was silent except for the crackling of my fire and my own ragged breathing. I began to think I'd imagined the whole thing. The cabin, the old woman, even the symbols on the trees that now seemed like ordinary knots and burls in the firelight. Then, just as I was considering trying to sleep, the whistling started again, closer than ever before, and not alone this time. Children's voices joined in, singing the words to the nursery rhyme in a haunting, off-key chorus. "Ring around the rosy, pocket full of posies, ashes, ashes, we all fall down." The voices circled my campsite, always just beyond the firelight. I clutched my knees to my chest, the herb bundle now crushed in my white-knuckled grip, its scent sharp in my nostrils. The singing continued, round and round, sometimes fading as if moving away, only to return louder than before. "Who's there?" I finally called, my voice cracking. "Please, just show yourselves." The singing stopped abruptly. In the sudden silence, I heard footsteps, light and quick, circling my camp. Then, at the very edge of the firelight, I saw her. A little girl, perhaps 8 or 9 years old, with long dark hair and a white dress that seemed to glow in the darkness. Her face was obscured by shadow, but I could feel her eyes on me. She stood perfectly still, just watching. "Hello?" I said softly, fighting the urge to run. "Are you lost? Too?" She didn't respond. Instead, she raised one pale arm and pointed behind me. I didn't want to turn. Every instinct screamed against taking my eyes off her. But a sound from the direction she pointed, a wet, rasping breath, forced me to look. On the opposite side of the clearing, another figure stood at the edge of the firelight. This one was tall and thin, impossibly so, its limbs elongated like the stick figures carved into the trees. It wore what looked like tattered rags, hanging from its emaciated frame. Its face was hidden in shadow, but I could see its mouth, a black gash stretching ear to ear, glistening wetly in the firelight. A strangled scream caught in my throat. I scrambled backward, nearly into the fire, my eyes darting between the child and the tall figure. When I looked back to where the girl had been, she was gone. In her place stood 5 more children, all with the same long dark hair and white clothing, all with their faces obscured, all pointing at the tall figure. The thing took a step forward, one grotesquely long limb extending into the firelight. Its skin was grayish-white, covered in what looked like mold or fungus, pulsing slightly as if alive. The herb bundle in my hand suddenly grew hot, almost burning my palm. Without thinking, I threw it at the creature. The bundle burst into bright blue flames the moment it left my hand, arcing through the air like a comet. It struck the tall figure squarely in the chest. A sound erupted from the thing, a screech so high-pitched and inhuman it made my ears ring and my vision blur. The creature thrashed, blue flames spreading rapidly across its body, illuminating its face for one terrible moment. Not a face at all, but a writhing mass of what looked like roots or tendrils, twisting and coiling around a central void. The children began to sing again, their voices rising above the creature's dying wails. Ring around the rosy, pocket full of posies, ashes, ashes, we all fall down. On the final line, they surged forward as one, passing through my fire without disturbing the flames, their small hands outstretched toward the burning creature. They reached it in seconds, surrounding it completely, their white clothing glowing blue in the supernatural fire. What happened next is difficult to describe. The children seemed to absorb the creature, or perhaps merge with it, their forms blurred together, becoming a whirling mass of blue flame and shadow that grew smaller and denser until, with a sound like a thunderclap, it collapsed entirely, leaving nothing but a scorched patch of earth where the tall figure had stood. The silence that followed was absolute. The children were gone. The creature was gone. Even my campfire seemed subdued, its flames burning lower though I'd added fresh wood just minutes before. I didn't sleep. Couldn't sleep. I sat rigid beside my fire until dawn, feeding it religiously, jumping at every sound from the surrounding forest. When the first gray light of morning filtered through the trees, I packed my equipment with shaking hands and prepared to leave, though I still had no idea which direction would lead me back to civilization. You survived, then. I spun around, heart leaping to my throat. Mrs. Greer stood at the edge of the clearing looking exactly as she had the evening before. In daylight, she seemed somehow both more real and more out of place, her old-fashioned clothing and weathered face belonging to another century entirely. What was that thing?" I asked, my voice hoarse from a night of fear. Mrs. Greer's pale eyes flickered to the scorched earth where the creature had burned. "The forest has its guardians," she said cryptically, "and its predators. That one has been hunting these woods for generations. And the children," a shadow passed over her face, "also guardians in their way. They were its first victims long ago. Now they protect others when they can." The implication of her words struck me like a physical blow. Those children had died here, in these woods, at the hands, or whatever it had, of that thing. And now they were bound to this place, both victims and protectors. "How do you know all this?" I asked, studying her face more closely. Something about her seemed increasingly familiar, though I was certain we'd never met before. Mrs. Greer didn't answer directly. Instead, she asked, "Do you know the history of Greer Spring?" I shook my head. "It's named for my family. We settled here in the 1850s, built a mill, a homestead." Her voice took on a distant quality, as if reciting from memory. There were 12 children in the original Greer family. By 1892, only 3 remained. The others disappeared into these woods, one by one. A chill crept up my spine despite the warming morning air. "What happened to them?" "The forest took them," she said simply. "Or rather, what lives in the forest. The thing you saw last night, we called it the Tall Man. The Osage people knew about it long before white settlers arrived. They had rituals to keep it at bay, but the settlers didn't listen. And the remaining Greers? What happened to them?" Her pale eyes met mine directly. Martha Greer, that was me, went into the forest to find the missing children. She never returned, according to official records. My mind reeled, trying to process what she was saying. "You're claiming to be Martha Greer? From the 1800s? A faint smile curved her thin lips. "I'm not claiming anything. I'm telling you what happened." "But that's impossible. You'd be—" I did the quick math in my head. "Over 150 years old." "Time moves differently in certain parts of the forest," she said, "especially for those of us who've made bargains with it." "Bargains? What kind of bargains?" Her expression grew somber. "The only kind that matter. The ones that save lives. I couldn't save the children who were already taken, but I could help them find peace, and I could protect others who wandered too far off the path. I wanted to dismiss her words as the ramblings of a delusional old woman, but after what I'd witnessed the night before, I couldn't bring myself to disbelieve her entirely. "The tall man isn't gone," Mrs. Greer continued. "What you saw was just one manifestation. It will reform, as it always does, but it will be weaker for a time, and the children have claimed another piece of it. I don't understand. Every time they capture a piece of it, they regain a piece of themselves, their memories, their humanity." Her eyes grew distant. "One day, perhaps, they'll gather enough to move on from this place, to wherever they should have gone long ago." She reached out suddenly, grasping my wrist with surprising strength. Her fingers were ice cold against my skin. "The forest recognized something in you, Emily Hall. Something broken, something seeking. It called to you, just as it calls to everyone who comes here carrying pain." I tried to pull away, but her grip tightened. "What do you mean?" "The tall man feeds on despair, on the emptiness inside people. It draws them in, wears them down, makes them vulnerable." Her pale eyes bored into mine. "You came here broken-hearted, looking to lose yourself. That's dangerous in these woods. The forest might have decided to keep you." A shiver ran through me at her words. I thought of Daniel, of the hollow ache his betrayal had left inside me, of how I'd come here hoping to outrun that pain. Had I really been so transparent, so vulnerable? "But something protected you," Mrs. Greer continued, releasing my wrist at last. "Something the forest respects. Perhaps your will to survive. Perhaps something else entirely." She reached into her apron pocket again and withdrew another bundle of herbs, larger than the first, wrapped in what looked like a piece of faded calico fabric. "Take this with you. Keep it close until you're well beyond the boundaries of the forest." She pressed it into my hand. "And if you ever hear whistling at night, wherever you are, light a fire immediately. The tall man has marked you now. It may come looking again." The bundle was warm against my palm, unlike Mrs. Greer's cold touch. I closed my fingers around it, not knowing what to say. "Now, let me show you the way back." She turned and began walking through the trees, not waiting to see if I followed. I shouldered my pack and hurried after her, not wanting to be left alone in this strange part of the forest. We walked in silence for what seemed like hours, though the sun barely moved in the sky. The terrain gradually began to look more familiar, less densely packed trees, clearer undergrowth, occasional signs of human presence like old fire rings or carved initials on tree trunks. Finally, we emerged onto a wide, well-maintained trail with clear markers. "The Devil's Backbone," Mrs. Greer said, gesturing ahead. "Follow it north, that way, for about 3 miles. You'll reach the ranger station." Relief flooded through me. "Thank you," I said fervently. "I don't know what would have happened if you hadn't found me." Her expression remained impassive. The forest calls to certain people, sometimes to help, sometimes to harm. Her pale eyes held mine. "It called to you. Remember that." She reached out again, this time placing her cold palm against my cheek. The gesture was oddly tender, almost maternal. "The broken places inside us are doorways. Emily, be careful what you let enter through them." Before I could respond, she turned and walked back into the trees, disappearing as quickly as she had the night before. I stood frozen for a moment, her words echoing in my mind. Then I turned and began hiking north along the trail, clutching the herb bundle tightly. I walked briskly, eager to put as much distance as possible between myself and whatever lurked in the deeper parts of the forest. I reached the ranger station by midday. The ranger on duty was surprised to see me. Apparently, I'd been reported missing when I failed to check in the previous evening. According to him, I had somehow wandered nearly 15 miles off my planned route into a section of the forest that wasn't even open to hikers due to dangerous sinkholes and unstable terrain. When I tried to explain what had happened, mentioning the cabin and Mrs. Greer, he gave me an odd look. There's no cabin in that section of forest, ma'am. And the only Greer I know of around these parts was Martha Greer, who the spring is named after. She disappeared in those woods back in 1892. They never found her body." He showed me an old photograph hanging on the station wall, a group of settlers standing in front of a small cabin, dated 1890. My blood ran cold as I recognized the woman standing slightly apart from the others. White hair in a long braid, apron over a dark dress, and eyes so pale they appeared white in the faded photograph. The ranger followed my gaze. "That's her, Martha Greer. Local legend says she was a healer who learned too much from the native people and the forest itself. Some say she still wanders those woods, helping lost hikers, or leading them deeper in." My fingers tightened around the herb bundle in my pocket. "What do they say happened to the children who disappeared?" The ranger's expression darkened. "Nasty business, that. According to the records, 9 Greer children vanished over a period of about 20 years. Most folks at the time blamed wild animals or accidents, but there were rumors." He trailed off, seeming reluctant to continue. "What kind of rumors?" I pressed. He hesitated, then lowered his voice, though we were alone in the station. "Folks said there was something in the forest that took them. Called it different names. The Tall Man, the Root Walker, the Hollow One. Native legends talked about it too, a spirit that fed on the innocent. Pure superstition, of course," he added quickly, straightening up. "But the disappearances were real enough." I nodded, not trusting myself to speak. The ranger must have mistaken my silence for fatigue, because he insisted I rest while he called for a vehicle to transport me back to town. I didn't argue. I wanted nothing more than to be away from the Mark Twain National Forest and its secrets. That night, in the relative safety of a motel room in Winona, I examined the herb bundle Mrs. Greer had given me. It contained a variety of dried plants I couldn't identify, along with what looked like small bones, bird or rodent, I hoped, and a piece of carved wood in the shape of one of the symbols I'd seen on the trees. The calico fabric wrapping it was ancient. The pattern faded to almost nothing, and when I looked closely, I could see tiny, precise stitches along one edge, forming letters. M.G. Martha Greer. I keep that bundle with me still. It sits on my bedside table in a small wooden box next to the photograph the ranger let me take. A picture of the picture on his wall, showing Martha Greer and her pale, knowing eyes. I've researched her extensively since returning to St. Louis. Historical records confirm most of what she told me. The Greer family, the disappearances, her own vanishing in 1892. What the records don't explain is why the missing children were all described as having long dark hair, or why they disappeared during the week of the full moon, or why Martha Greer, at age 62, would venture alone into a forest known to be dangerous even then. I left the Mark Twain National Forest, but in a way, it never left me. I hear the whistling sometimes, especially on quiet autumn nights just like tonight, a thin, reedy tune that sounds like Ring Around the Rosie coming from outside my window. And when I look, I sometimes glimpse a small figure at the edge of the nearby woods, arm raised, pointing at something behind me. It was 3 months after my return to St. Louis that I first saw one of the children outside my apartment building. I was coming home late from work, exhausted after another long day trying to lose myself in architectural drawings and client meetings. The streetlights cast long shadows across the parking lot as I approached my building. Movement at the corner of my eye made me turn, and there she was, the same little girl I'd seen in the forest, long dark hair, white dress, standing perfectly still beneath a maple tree. My keys slipped from suddenly nerveless fingers, clattering to the pavement. By the time I'd retrieved them and looked up, she was gone. But the maple tree's branches were swaying, though there was no wind that night. I convinced myself it was stress, lack of sleep, my mind playing tricks. But then I began to notice other things. The faint smell of forest loam in my apartment, though I lived on the 5th floor. Cold spots that would appear and disappear in various rooms. The way my electronic devices would sometimes malfunction. screens filling with static before returning to normal, and always the feeling of being watched. I tried to talk to Lisa about it once, over coffee. She'd been thrilled when I returned from my transformative wilderness experience, as she called it, noting how much healthier I looked, how the haunted expression had left my eyes. "I think something followed me back from the forest," I told her, trying to keep my voice casual while watching her reaction closely. She laughed. "Like a bear? Or just a newfound appreciation for nature?" "More like a presence," I said carefully. "I keep seeing things, hearing things." Her smile faded slightly. Are you sleeping okay? I know the whole Daniel thing really did a number on you." I backed off immediately, forcing a laugh of my own. "I'm fine, just being dramatic. Too many horror movies lately, I guess." But I wasn't fine. The incidents grew more frequent as autumn deepened toward winter. One night, I woke to find my bedroom window open, though I distinctly remembered closing and locking it before bed. Another time, I discovered small, muddy footprints leading from my front door to the bathroom and back. Footprints that vanished even as I stared at them, the mud drying and crumbling to dust before my eyes. Then came the night I heard the singing again. I'd been working late on a particularly challenging project, sketching preliminary designs for a nature center ironically being built near the Mark Twain National Forest. Around midnight, I put down my pencil and stretched, muscles aching from hours hunched over my drafting table. That's when I heard it. Children's voices, singing just outside my apartment door. "Ring around the rosy, pocket full of posies, ashes, ashes, we all fall down." I froze, pencil still clutched in my hand, heart hammering against my ribs. The singing continued, over and over, the voices sometimes in unison, sometimes discordantly overlapping. I knew I should be terrified, but strangely, I felt no fear, only a deep, inexplicable sadness. Moving slowly, I approached my apartment door and pressed my ear against it. The singing was clearer now, and I could distinguish individual voices, some high and sweet, others lower, but all unmistakably children's. I took a deep breath and yanked the door open. The hallway was empty. The singing stopped abruptly. But there, on the floor just outside my door, sat a small bundle of dried plants tied with red thread, identical to the one Mrs. Greer had first given me in the forest. I brought it inside with trembling hands and placed it beside the original bundle in its wooden box. As I did, I noticed something I hadn't before. A scrap of yellowed paper tucked into the first bundle. Carefully, I extracted it and unfolded it to reveal spidery handwriting. "The broken places are doorways. Close them before it's too late." That night, I dreamed of the forest. In the dream, I was walking along the Devil's Backbone Trail, but everything was wrong. The trees grew sideways, their branches twisting to form archways overhead. The ground beneath my feet pulsed like a living thing. The air itself seemed thick and resistant, as if I were moving through water. Ahead of me on the trail, the children walked in a line, holding hands. I could see only their backs, their long dark hair swaying in unison. They were leading me somewhere, deeper into the dream forest. I wanted to call out to them, to ask where we were going, but my voice wouldn't work. The last child in line turned to look at me over her shoulder. Her face was a blur, features indistinct except for her eyes, dark, liquid pools that held infinite sadness. She reached back, offering her small hand to me. I hesitated, then took it. Her fingers were ice cold but solid, real. The moment our hands connected, the forest around us changed. The wrongness receded, the trees straightened, the air lightened. The other children turned to face me. Their features also blurred except for those same sad eyes. "He's coming," the girl holding my hand said, her voice like dry leaves rustling. "He found the doorway you left open." "What doorway?" I asked, my voice working in the dream now. "I don't understand." "The empty places," another child said, a boy this time. "The places where you were hollowed out. He can slip through, just as we did." "But we want to help," said a third child. "We've been trying to warn you." "Warn me about what?" I asked. But even as the words left my mouth, I felt it. A cold presence behind me, a shifting in the fabric of the dream. The children's eyes widened in unison, staring at something over my shoulder. "He's here," the girl whispered, squeezing my hand tightly. "Remember what Martha taught you. Fire cleanses. Boundaries protect." I turned, slowly, dreading what I would see. The tall man stood there, just as he had in the forest clearing. Impossibly elongated limbs, ragged clothing, and that terrible mouth stretching ear to ear. But now I could see its eyes, or rather the empty sockets where eyes should be, bottomless pits that seemed to draw me in. It reached for me with one grotesquely long arm, fingers like twisted roots stretching toward my face. I woke, gasping, drenched in cold sweat, sheets tangled around my legs as if I'd been thrashing. The digital clock beside my bed read 3:17 a.m., its red numerals the only light in the room. As my breathing slowed, I became aware of two things simultaneously: an intense, almost medicinal smell filling the air, and a sound coming from my living room, the creak of weight on floorboards. Someone, or something, was in my apartment. Fight or flight instinct kicked in, and I reached for my phone to call 911. The screen lit up at my touch, but instead of the familiar interface, it displayed only static, along with a single line of text that made no sense. "Elle attend dans les bois. Elle a toujours faim." The same phrase from the book in the cabin. The creaking floorboards grew closer, approaching my bedroom door. I slid out of bed as quietly as possible, grabbing the heavy metal flashlight I kept on my nightstand. My mind raced, trying to remember exactly what the little girl in my dream had said. Fire cleanses. Boundaries protect. I had no fire, but I did have boundaries. I lunged for the wooden box containing the herb bundles, nearly knocking it from the nightstand in my haste. The smell grew stronger as I clutched one in each hand, the scent sharp and clean against the growing mustiness in the air. My bedroom door began to open, slowly, the hinges protesting with a low whine. "Stay back," I said, my voice steadier than I expected. "You can't come in here. I don't invite you." The door continued to open. Through the widening gap I could see nothing but darkness, a darkness deeper and more absolute than the normal shadows of my apartment. It seemed to pulse, to breathe. "I said stay back," I repeated, louder this time. "This is my space, my boundary. You are not welcome here." The darkness hesitated, seeming to recoil slightly. Emboldened, I took a step forward, still clutching the herb bundles. "I close the doorways," I continued, remembering Mrs. Greer's words, the note. "The broken places inside me are healing. You have no way in, no invitation, no welcome." A sound came from the darkness then. Not quite a voice, but something trying to form words. It reminded me of wind through dead leaves, or water over stones. Elemental, ancient. "Emily," it seemed to say, drawing out the syllables until they barely resembled my name. "Let us in?" Us, not just the tall man then. "No," I said firmly, taking another step toward the door. The darkness writhed, tendrils of it reaching toward me only to pull back, as if testing an invisible barrier. "You are not welcome in my home, in my life, in my heart. Go back to the forest. It's where you belong." The tendrils withdrew further, but the darkness remained, pulsing in the doorway. Then, slowly, shapes began to form within it. Small figures stepping forward, their outlines gradually solidifying until I could make out the children. 6 of them, standing in a semicircle just outside my bedroom door, their features clearer than I'd ever seen them. 3 boys, 3 girls, ranging in age from about 6 to 12, all with the same long dark hair, all wearing white clothing that seemed to glow faintly in the darkness. Their faces were solemn, their eyes, those infinitely sad eyes, fixed on me, "He can't come in," the oldest girl said, the same one who had held my hand in the dream. "You've closed the doorways." "But we can, because you invited us. You felt our pain. You wanted to help us." "I don't understand," I said, lowering the herb bundle slightly. "What do you want from me?" "The same thing you want," said one of the boys. "To be free." "How?" I asked. "How can I help you be free?" "By remembering," said another girl, the youngest by the look of her, "by bearing witness. Our stories were lost, our names forgotten, even our bones lie unmarked. We need someone to remember," the oldest girl continued, "to know what happened to us, to speak our names." "But I don't know your names," I said, confused. "Yes, you do," said the oldest boy. "Martha told you, in her own way. Look at what she gave you." I glanced down at the herb bundles in my hands, then at the wooden box on my nightstand. Something clicked in my mind, a connection I should have made earlier. "The journal in the cabin," I said slowly. "It was Martha's, wasn't it? She was writing about you, about what happened." The children nodded in unison. "And the cabin, it was the Greer homestead, where you lived, where you died." Another nod. "The tall man took you, one by one. And Martha tried to save us," the oldest girl said. "She found a way to bind herself to the forest, to remain as a guardian, to help trapped souls like ours find peace." "But she couldn't do it alone," added one of the boys. "The tall man is too powerful, too ancient. She needed someone else, someone who could bridge the worlds." "Someone like you," the youngest girl said. "Someone who knows what it means to be hollowed out, but who found the strength to fill those spaces again." I thought of Daniel, of the devastation his betrayal had caused, of the emptiness I'd carried into the forest, but also of the healing that had begun there, facing the darkness, surviving it. The broken places inside me were mending, slowly but surely. "What do I need to do?" I asked. "Speak our names," the oldest girl said simply. "Remember us, tell our story." "But I don't know your names," I repeated. "Look deeper," she urged, "in what Martha gave you." I turned to the wooden box, eyeing it uncertainly. Then, carefully, I set down the herb bundles and picked up the box itself. It was heavier than it should have been, made of dark, polished wood with no visible seams or hinges. I'd never examined it closely before, assuming it was just a simple container. Now, running my fingers over its surface, I felt subtle indentations, letters carved into the bottom, nearly invisible unless you knew to look for them. 6 sets of initials with dates beside them, e.g. 1860, 1866, HG, 1862, 1868, WG, 1865, 1871, JG, 1867, 1873, SG, 1869, 1875, AG, 1871, 1877, 6 children. 6 Greer children, their birth and death dates carefully preserved by Martha in this hidden record. "Eliza," I said suddenly, the name coming to me from nowhere, or perhaps from somewhere deep in my subconscious, some fragment of the research I'd done on the Greer family. Eliza Greer. The oldest girl smiled, a genuine smile that transformed her solemn face. "Yes," she said softly, "I'm Eliza." One by one, the names came to me, flowing as if Martha herself were whispering them in my ear. Henry, William, Jane, Samuel, Alice. As I spoke each name, the corresponding child smiled, their forms growing slightly brighter, more substantial. "We were forgotten," Eliza said when I had named them all. "Our deaths recorded as accidents, illness, disappearance. The truth buried with Martha's disappearance. But you found us. You can tell our story now." "Will that free you?" I asked. "If I tell your story?" "It's a beginning," Henry said. "Each time someone speaks our names, remembers what happened, we become more ourselves again, less tied to the tall man, to the forest." "But be careful," Jane warned. "The tall man knows you now. It will try to silence you, to claim you as it claimed us." "That's why we came," Samuel added. "To warn you, to protect you if we can." "It followed you from the forest," Alice, the youngest, said. "It's been looking for a way in." "How do I stop it?" I asked. "Fire cleanses, boundaries protect. But what does that mean, exactly?" "Martha's herbs will help," Eliza said. "They create a barrier it cannot cross. But the strongest protection is truth, telling our story, speaking our names, bringing light to what happened. The tall man feeds on secrets, on things hidden and forgotten," William explained. "Truth weakens it, always has." I nodded slowly, beginning to understand. "So I research what happened to you, write it down, make it known." "Yes," Eliza confirmed, "but not just to anyone. Find those who need to hear it, the forest's caretakers, the guardians of its history." "The park rangers," I said, "the Historical Society in Winona, the Osage representatives." The children nodded in unison. "We have to go now," Eliza said, glancing over her shoulder at the darkness beyond my bedroom door. "It's still out there, waiting. We can hold it back for a time, but not forever." "Will I see you again?" I asked, surprised by how much I wanted them to say yes. "When you return to the forest," Henry said. "We're bound to it still, though less tightly now that you've spoken our names." "Be watchful," Jane added. "The tall man is patient. It has waited centuries for its victims. It can wait for you." "Remember what Martha taught you," Samuel said. "Fire cleanses, boundaries protect." "And truth illuminates," Alice finished, her small face solemn once more. With those final words, the children began to fade, their outlines blurring, bodies becoming translucent until only their eyes remained visible. 6 pairs of sad, dark eyes floating in the darkness. Then they too disappeared, and the unnatural shadows receded from my doorway, leaving only the normal darkness of my apartment at night. I didn't sleep again that night. Instead, I sat at my computer, researching everything I could find about the Greer family, the disappearances of their children, and Martha Greer's final expedition into the forest. I found surprisingly little in the official historical records. Just as the children had said, their deaths had been attributed to accidents, illness, or simply recorded as missing, presumed dead. But in local newspaper archives, I found more. Reports of strange sightings in the forest around the times of the disappearances, accounts of Martha Greer's increasing isolation and peculiar behavior following each loss, descriptions of unusual markings found on trees near where the children were last seen. As dawn broke, I made a decision. I would return to the Mark Twain National Forest, to the place where all of this began. I would find the site of the original Greer homestead, the cabin I'd seen, and document everything. Then I would take my findings to the authorities the children had named: the Forest Service, the Historical Society, the Osage representatives. I would tell their story. I would speak their names. I would bring truth to light. It took me 2 weeks to prepare for the journey. I was meticulous this time, leaving nothing to chance. I studied maps of the forest, focusing on the area where I'd gotten lost before. I researched the history of Greer Spring and the surrounding region. I even took self-defense classes, though I knew they would be useless against something like the tall man. Most importantly, I prepared protection. Following instincts I didn't fully understand, perhaps Martha's influence, perhaps my own awakening sensitivity, I created herb bundles similar to the ones she had given me. I couldn't identify all the plants she'd used, but I found close approximations at a local herbalist shop, along with red thread to bind them. I made a dozen bundles, tucking them into various pockets of my hiking gear. I also brought fire, waterproof matches, multiple lighters, emergency flares. "Fire cleanses," Martha had said. I wasn't taking any chances. When I told Lisa I was returning to the forest, she thought I was crazy. "You got lost there for 2 days last time," she reminded me over dinner the night before my departure. "The rangers had to file a missing persons report. Why would you go back?" "I need closure," I said simply. not knowing how else to explain it. There's something I left unfinished. She studied my face, concern evident in her eyes. You've been different since you came back, you know. More centered, more confident, which is great. But sometimes you get this look, like you're seeing something the rest of us can't. I didn't know how to respond to that, so I just smiled and changed the subject. How could I explain that she was right, that I was seeing things others couldn't, that 6 dead children had stood in my bedroom doorway and asked me to tell their story, that an ancient evil from the forest had followed me home and was waiting for a chance to take me as it had taken them? The next morning, I parked at the same trailhead where I'd started my first hike 3 months earlier. The autumn colors had faded now, most trees bare, the forest floor carpeted with decaying leaves. The air was sharper, colder, the sky a pale, washed-out blue that promised winter not far off. The ranger at the station was different this time, a young woman who checked my permit with brisk efficiency. When I mentioned I was interested in the history of Greer Spring and the Greer family, however, she paused, looking at me more carefully. "Historical research?" she asked. "Something like that," I replied. "I'm particularly interested in Martha Greer and what happened to her." The ranger's expression shifted subtly. "Not many people ask about that," she said. "It's not exactly a happy story." "I know," I said, "but I think it's an important one." She hesitated, then reached under the counter and pulled out a small worn book. "This isn't official Forest Service material," she said, pushing it toward me. "It's a collection of local stories my grandmother put together. There's a chapter on the Greers. Might help with your research." I accepted the book gratefully, tucking it into my pack. "Thank you. I'll take good care of it." She nodded. "Just stay on the marked trails," she said, unconsciously echoing the first ranger's warning. "And if you hear anything strange—" "Sound carries funny out there," I finished for her. "I remember." Her eyebrows rose slightly, but she didn't comment further, just stamped my permit and wished me a safe hike. This time, I had no intention of staying on the marked trails, but I kept that to myself. I had a specific destination in mind, the clearing where I'd seen the cabin, where I'd first met the children and the tall man. My research suggested it was about 12 miles from the trailhead, in a section of the forest that was indeed restricted due to dangerous terrain. I hiked steadily all day, pushing myself to cover ground while the light lasted. Unlike my first journey, I felt no sense of peace or relaxation in the forest now. Instead, I was hyper-aware of every sound, every movement, every shadow. The weight of the herb bundles in my pockets was reassuring, as was the book from the ranger, further confirmation that I wasn't crazy, that the Greer story was real. As the sun began to lower in the sky, I made camp in a small clearing well off the main trail. I chose the spot carefully, open enough to give good visibility in all directions, but with a large rock formation at my back to prevent anything from approaching unseen. I built my fire larger than necessary for the mild temperature, creating a wide circle of light and warmth. As I sat beside the flames, eating a simple dinner of trail mix and jerky, I opened the ranger's book. It was hand-bound, the pages yellowed with age, filled with neat handwriting and occasional newspaper clippings. I turned to the chapter on the Greers. The story it told aligned with what I'd learned from my research and from the children themselves. The Greer family had settled near what was now called Greer Spring in the 1850s, building a mill and a homestead. They had 12 children originally, 9 of whom disappeared over a period of 17 years. The disappearances followed a pattern, always during the week of the full moon, always children who had ventured alone into the forest. The locals had various explanations: wild animals, accidents, even kidnapping by remnants of indigenous tribes, a theory the book rightfully dismissed as prejudiced nonsense. But there were other accounts as well, ones that hadn't made it into the official records. Stories of an unnaturally tall figure seen at the forest's edge before each disappearance, reports of children singing heard in the woods at night, descriptions of strange markings found on trees near the Greer property. Martha Greer, the grandmother of the missing children, had increasingly insisted that something in the forest was taking them. According to journal entries quoted in the book, she had consulted with an Osage medicine man who told her of an ancient spirit that fed on the innocent, a thing that had been in the forest since before humans arrived, that could take different forms, but was most often seen as an unnaturally tall, thin figure. The medicine man had taught Martha protective rituals and given her herbs to ward off the spirit. She had apparently spent years trying to protect her remaining family members, to no avail. Finally, in 1892, after the disappearance of Alice Greer, the youngest of my ghostly visitors, Martha had announced she was going into the forest to find the children, or at least their remains. She never returned, and the official record listed her as another victim of the dangerous wilderness. But local legend, as recorded in the book, told a different story, that Martha had made a bargain with the forest itself, exchanging her mortal life for the ability to remain as a guardian spirit, protecting travelers and continuing her search for the lost children. The final pages of the chapter contained what appeared to be a copy of a page from Martha's own journal, dated just days before her disappearance. I have found the way to bind it, temporarily at least. The mixture of herbs, prepared as Running Fox showed me, burns with a blue flame that causes it great pain. The symbols carved into the trees create boundaries it cannot easily cross. But this is not enough. The children remain trapped. I hear them singing at night, their souls caught between worlds. To free them requires more than I alone can give. The tall man, as the little ones called it before they were taken, is too powerful, too ancient. It has fed on fear and innocence for centuries. Tomorrow I go into the forest for the last time. I have made my preparations, said my goodbyes. If my plan succeeds, I will not return as the woman I am now, but I will remain, in some form, to guide those who might one day help free the children. It will take someone who understands loss but has not been consumed by it. Someone who has looked into the empty places within themselves and found the strength to fill them again. When such a person comes to the forest, I will know them, and I will help them, as Running Fox has helped me. Elle attend dans les bois. Elle a toujours faim, but we are waiting too, and our hunger for justice, for peace, is just as strong. The passage sent chills down my spine. Martha had known. Somehow she had known that someone like me would come, someone who could help free the children. And she had been waiting, all this time, to guide that person, to guide me. I closed the book, staring into the flames of my campfire. Tomorrow I would try to find the site of the Greer homestead again. I would document everything, take photographs, record coordinates, collect any evidence I could find. Then I would bring it all back, share it with those who needed to know, ensure that Eliza, Henry, William, Jane, Samuel, and Alice were not forgotten. I had just begun to prepare for sleep when I heard it, the now familiar thin, reedy whistling. Unlike my first night in the forest, I felt no fear, only a grim determination. I added more wood to my fire, making the flames leap higher, and waited. The whistling circled my camp, sometimes closer, sometimes farther away. Occasionally it was joined by faint singing, the children's voices, barely audible but unmistakable. They were out there, watching, waiting, and so was the tall man. I sensed it before I saw it, a coldness in the air, a deepening of shadows beyond the firelight. Then, slowly, it emerged at the edge of the clearing. Just as before, it was impossibly tall and thin, its limbs elongated and jointed in ways no human body could be, its ragged clothing hanging from its emaciated frame. Its face was hidden in shadow, but I could see the gleam of its terrible mouth stretching ear to ear. "I know what you are," I called to it, my voice steadier than I'd expected. "I know what you did to those children. To Eliza, Henry, William, Jane, Samuel, and Alice." The thing recoiled slightly as I spoke the names, a hissing sound escaping from its gash of a mouth. "They're not yours anymore," I continued, drawing one of Martha's herb bundles from my pocket. "Martha Greer has been protecting them, and now I am too." The tall man took a step forward, then another, approaching the edge of my firelight. I could feel its hunger, its rage, its ancient malevolence radiating like cold heat. It reached out one grotesquely long arm, fingers like twisted roots stretching toward me across the barrier of light. I held up the herb bundle. "Fire cleanses," I said, and touched it to the flames of my campfire. The bundle ignited instantly, burning with the same bright blue fire I had seen before. The tall man recoiled, that inhuman hissing intensifying. I stood, holding the burning bundle like a torch, and took a step toward the creature. "Boundaries protect," I continued, drawing a line in the dirt with my boot, connecting to the large rock formation behind me. "This is my space. You are not welcome here." The tall man retreated another step, but didn't leave. It seemed to be studying me, its body swaying slightly like a reed in wind. Then, to my horror, it began to change, its form blurring, shrinking, reshaping itself until it looked almost human. Almost, but not quite. It now resembled a man of normal height, dressed in hiking clothes similar to my own, but its proportions were still wrong. Arms too long, neck too thin, that terrible mouth still stretching across what should have been a human face. "Emily Hall," it said, its voice a rasping parody of human speech. "You think you understand, but you don't. Those children are mine. They have always been mine, and you will be too." "No," I said firmly, taking another step forward, the blue flames of my torch brightening. "They don't belong to you. They never did. And neither do I." The thing that looked almost like a man laughed, a sound like dry branches breaking. "Everyone belongs to me in the end. Every lost soul, every broken heart, every empty vessel. You came to my forest hollow and hurting. Part of you still is." Its words struck uncomfortably close to home. Despite my healing, despite my newfound strength, there were still empty places inside me. Spaces where trust had been betrayed, where love had been withdrawn. "You're right," I admitted, surprising both of us. "I am still healing, still finding my way back from loss. But that doesn't make me yours. It makes me human." I took another step forward, and to my satisfaction, the creature took a corresponding step back. "The children are finding their way too," I continued. "Every time someone speaks their names, remembers their story, they become more themselves and less yours. That's what Martha understood. That's why she stayed. Why she waited for someone who could help tell their story." The tall man's almost human form began to waver, elongating again, its outline growing less distinct. "Martha Greer," it rasped, contempt dripping from the name. "She thought she could defeat me with her plants and symbols. But I am older than names, older than memory. I was here before the first human set foot in this forest, and I will remain long after the last one is gone." "Maybe," I conceded, "but you won't have Eliza, Henry, William, Jane, Samuel, or Alice, and you won't have me." As I spoke each name, the blue flames of my torch grew brighter, and the tall man's form became less substantial, more shadow than solid. It retreated further from the light, its rasping voice fading. "This isn't over, Emily Hall," it said, barely audible now. "I am patient. I can wait." "So can I replied, "and I'm not alone." As if summoned by my words, the children appeared, stepping out of the darkness to stand between me and the retreating tall man. They were clearer than ever before, their small forms almost solid, their faces determined as they formed a protective line. "Go," Eliza commanded, her childish voice ringing with authority. "You have no power here tonight." The tall man's form wavered, stretched, then dissolved into the shadows of the forest. The oppressive feeling that had accompanied its presence lifted, leaving only the normal sounds and scents of the night woods. I lowered my still-burning torch, looking at the 6 children who now turned to face me. "Thank you," I said simply. "No," Henry replied. "Thank you for remembering us, for speaking our names, for coming back," William added. "I found a book about what happened," I told them, gesturing to my pack where the ranger's book lay. "It confirms everything. The disappearances, Martha's search for you, her final journey into the forest. She sacrificed much for us," Jane said solemnly, "and for all who might fall prey to the tall man." "Tomorrow I'll try to find the homestead site," I continued. "Document everything." "We can show you," Samuel offered. "We remember the way." "It looks different now," Alice warned. "The forest has reclaimed much, but the foundations remain, and some artifacts." "That would be incredibly helpful," I said, feeling a surge of affection for these solemn, brave children who had endured so much. Eliza stepped forward, reaching out to touch my burning torch. The blue flames didn't seem to harm her. Instead, they reflected in her dark eyes, making them shine with an otherworldly light. "Rest now," she said. "She will watch over you tonight. The tall man won't return. It's weakened by the names, by the truth coming to light. Tomorrow we'll guide you," Henry added, "to the homestead, to where it happened." I nodded, suddenly aware of how exhausted I was. "Thank you," I said again, not knowing what else to say in the face of their quiet courage. The children smiled, sad, sweet smiles that transformed their solemn faces and began to fade, becoming translucent, then transparent, until only their outlines remained, barely visible in the firelight. But I could still feel their presence, protective and watchful, as I banked my fire and crawled into my tent. I slept deeply that night, undisturbed by dreams or nocturnal visitors. When I woke, the morning sun was filtering through the trees, casting dappled shadows across my tent. For a moment, I wondered if the events of the previous night had been a dream. The tall man, the children, their promise to guide me. But the charred remains of the herb bundle beside my fire pit confirmed it had been real. I ate a quick breakfast and packed my gear efficiently. As I was collapsing my tent, I felt it, the subtle shift in the air that now signaled the children's presence. I turned to find all 6 of them standing at the edge of my camp, more solid and clear in daylight than I had ever seen them. "Good morning," I said, trying to sound casual as if greeting ghostly children in the wilderness was an everyday occurrence. "Good morning, Emily," Eliza replied, her voice stronger than it had been the night before. "Are you ready?" I nodded, shouldering my pack. "Lead the way." They moved through the forest with silent grace, occasionally glancing back to ensure I was following. I noticed they left no footprints on the soft forest floor, no disturbance in the carpet of fallen leaves. They led me off any marked trail, through dense undergrowth and across small streams, following a path only they could see. After about 2 hours of hiking, Henry raised his hand, signaling a stop. "We're close," he said softly, "just beyond those trees." I looked where he pointed and saw nothing special, just more forest. But as we continued forward, I began to notice subtle changes in the terrain. The trees grew differently here, younger than those in the surrounding area, suggesting this land had once been cleared. The ground underfoot became less even, with occasional rises and depressions that might once have been foundations or pathways. Then we emerged into a clearing and I knew we had arrived. Though the cabin was long gone, its footprint remained, a rectangular depression in the earth, with scattered stones that had once formed its foundation. Nearby, the remains of what must have been the well were visible, now just a ring of stones around a filled-in hole. And at the edge of the clearing stood an ancient oak tree, its trunk wider than I could have embraced with both arms, its branches spreading protectively over what might once have been a yard. The children spread out across the clearing, each going to a specific spot, standing silent and solemn. I realized they were showing me where things had been, where they had lived, played, died. "The cabin stood here," Eliza said, standing in the center of the rectangular depression. The main room where we ate and gathered. The sleeping lofts were above. The kitchen was here, Jane added, indicating a smaller depression nearby. Martha's herbs hung from the rafters. And this, William said, walking to the massive oak, was our climbing tree. We all loved it. I followed him to the tree, noting the worn places on its trunk where countless small feet had found purchase, the low branches perfect for a child to grasp. As I approached, I saw something else, carvings in the bark, faded with time but still legible, initials, dates, childish drawings. You carved these, I said softly. Samuel nodded. All of us did. It was tradition when you were old enough to climb alone. I examined the carvings more closely, finding all 6 sets of initials among others, evidence of the children's existence preserved in living wood for over a century. And where? I hesitated, not wanting to ask but needing to know. Where did it happen? Where did the tall man take you? The children exchanged glances, a silent communication passing between them. Then Alice, the youngest, took my hand. Her touch was cool, but not unpleasant, like a gentle breeze against my skin. I'll show you, she said, her voice tiny but determined. I was the last. I remember the clearest. She led me away from the clearing, deeper into the forest, the other children following at a distance. We walked for perhaps 10 minutes before coming to a small, sheltered hollow nestled between 2 rocky outcroppings. A spring bubbled up from the ground here, forming a shallow pool before continuing as a narrow stream. It waited here, Alice said, pointing to a dark space between the rocks. I came to collect water for Martha's dying. It was my chore that day. I could picture it all too clearly, a small girl with a bucket, sent on a simple errand, unaware of what waited in the shadows. It called to me, Alice continued, her voice distant as if recalling a dream. Not with words, but with feelings. Curiosity, then fear, then nothing. Darkness. I'm so sorry, I said, inadequate words for such a terrible memory. Alice looked up at me, her dark eyes infinitely old in her child's face. This is where my body is, she said simply. All of us are here, hidden in the earth or the water. I looked around with new understanding. This wasn't just the site of an attack. It was a grave. 6 small bodies, never recovered, never properly laid to rest. This is what needs to be marked, I said, sudden certainty filling me. This place needs to be found, documented, remembered. Yes, Eliza said, joining us with the others. Our names, our story, and our resting place. All of it needs to be remembered. I spent the rest of the day documenting everything. The homestead site, the children's tree, and most importantly, the hollow where they had died and still lay buried. I took photographs, made sketches, recorded GPS coordinates. I collected small samples of soil and water that might contain physical evidence after all these years. As the sun began to set, I knew I needed to make camp for the night. The children led me to a suitable clearing not far from the homestead site, and I set up my tent and built a fire just as the last light faded from the sky. You should leave in the morning, Eliza said as we sat around the fire. Take what you've gathered to those who need to see it. Will you be all right? I asked, then immediately felt foolish. They were ghosts, spirits. What danger could they face now? Henry smiled slightly, as if reading my thoughts. We're safer than we've been in over a century, he said. Every time you speak our names, every piece of evidence you document, we become more ourselves and less his. The tall man is weakened, William added. Not gone, but forced to retreat, to recover. He'll return, Jane warned. He always does. But it will take time, and by then, perhaps our story will be too widely known for him to silence. I nodded, understanding the urgency. I'll make sure of it. I'll take everything to the Forest Service, the Historical Society, the Osage representatives. I'll make them listen. "We know you will," Samuel said with quiet confidence. "That's why Martha guided you to us. She knew you would understand, that you would help." "Speaking of Martha," I said, suddenly realizing I hadn't seen the old woman since returning to the forest. "Where is she? Will I see her again before I leave?" The children exchanged glances. "Martha walks between worlds now," Eliza explained. "She appears when needed, then fades again. It takes great energy for her to manifest as she did for you." "But she's still watching," Alice added. "She's always watching over us, over the forest." I wanted to ask more, but something in their expressions stopped me. There were mysteries here I might never fully understand, boundaries between worlds that words couldn't easily cross. We sat in companionable silence as the fire burned lower. Eventually, the children began to fade, becoming translucent in the flickering light. "We need to go now," Eliza said, "but we'll be nearby, always." "Thank you," I said, meaning it from the depths of my soul, "for trusting me with your story." They smiled, those sad, sweet smiles that transformed their solemn faces. And then they were gone, leaving me alone with the crackling fire and the vast night sky above. I left the forest the next morning as planned, my pack heavy with evidence and my heart lighter than it had been in months. True to their word, I felt the children's presence accompanying me to the edge of the restricted area, a protective escort ensuring I found my way safely back to marked trails. The ranger at the station was surprised to see me return on schedule, with no mishaps or need for search parties this time. I returned her grandmother's book with sincere thanks, telling her it had been invaluable to my research. I didn't mention what else I'd found. That would come later, through official channels, with proper documentation. Over the following months, I worked tirelessly to bring the Greer children's story to light. I compiled all my evidence, research, and experiences into a comprehensive report. I met with representatives from the Forest Service, the Missouri Historical Society, and the Osage Nation. Some were skeptical at first, but the evidence was compelling, especially the soil samples from the hollow, which were found to contain trace elements consistent with human remains. An archaeological survey was eventually approved, conducted with the utmost respect for the site as both a historical landmark and a burial ground. Small bones were indeed discovered, confirming what I already knew. The hollow had been the children's final resting place for over a century. The Forest Service erected a memorial plaque at the site of the Greer homestead, listing the names and dates of all 9 children who had disappeared, with special mention of the 6 whose remains had been found. The Osage representatives conducted a blessing ceremony, honoring both the children and their grandmother, Martha Greer, whose sacrifice had protected countless travelers over the years. As for me, I returned to my life in St. Louis, but not unchanged. The broken places inside me had healed in ways I hadn't thought possible. Daniel's betrayal, once so devastating, now seemed like a distant memory. Painful, yes, but no longer defining. I had faced something far older and darker than heartbreak, and I had survived. I had helped 6 lost children find a measure of peace after more than a century of waiting. I still hear the whistling sometimes, on quiet autumn nights, but it no longer fills me with dread. Instead, I go to my window and look out toward the nearest trees, and sometimes, just sometimes, I glimpse small figures playing in the moonlight, their long, dark hair streaming behind them as they run and laugh and climb, free at last from the shadows that had bound them. And if I listen very carefully, I can hear them calling my name, not in fear or warning now, but in friendship, in gratitude, in the simple joy of being remembered. "Thank you, Emily," the wind seems to whisper. "Thank you for telling our story." "You're welcome," I always reply. "Eliza, Henry, William, Jane, Samuel, Alice, I will never forget you." And somewhere in the Mark Twain National Forest I know they hear me, and I know they smile. My name is Jason Adams, and I am 34 years old. This happened in the remote wilderness of Mark Twain National Forest in Missouri, where miles of dense woodland hide secrets older than the hills themselves. The thought of spending 2 weeks completely off-grid hadn't bothered me until I actually arrived. Standing at the trailhead where Beaver Creek wound its way into the forest, I felt the first flutter of unease. The October sun was already sinking toward the horizon, casting long shadows across the trail ahead. I checked my watch, 4:30 p.m. I'd have about an hour of good light left to hike to my first campsite. "Last chance to back out," said Daniel Lopez from beside me, his lean face already alive with excitement. "Once we're in, we're committed." I forced a laugh. After all the planning? No way. Dan and I had been planning this trip for months, a 14-day trek through the most isolated sections of Mark Twain National Forest, following Beaver Creek before cutting north toward the Devil's Backbone Wilderness. It had been Dan's idea, of course. As a wildlife photographer, he was always chasing the next remote location, the next untouched vista. I'd agreed partly because I needed material for my outdoor adventure blog, but mostly because after my bitter divorce from Rebecca 6 months earlier, I needed to prove I could still do hard things on my own. Our third companion, Mark Clark, was already adjusting his backpack straps, eager to get moving. Mark was the most experienced outdoorsman among us, a former Army Ranger who'd spent years learning wilderness survival skills. If anyone could get us through 2 weeks in the backcountry, it was Mark. "We're losing daylight," Mark said, his voice carrying that military crispness that never quite left him. 4 miles to the first campsite. Let's move." We shouldered our packs and set off, leaving civilization behind with each step. The trail was well marked at first, winding alongside Beaver Creek, the water gurgling pleasantly over smooth stones. The forest around us was alive with the sounds of birds and the occasional rustle of small animals in the underbrush. Dan stopped frequently to photograph particularly striking views, while Mark maintained a steady pace ahead, occasionally pausing to consult his topographical map. I walked between them, already feeling the weight of my pack digging into my shoulders. I wasn't out of shape, but I hadn't done serious backcountry hiking in years, not since before I met Rebecca. The thought of her stung less than it had a few months ago, but it was still there, the sense of failure, of not being enough. "Look at this, Jason," Dan called, pointing his camera toward a fallen tree covered in vibrant orange fungi. "Chicken of the woods, completely edible and supposedly tastes like chicken. We could harvest some." "Let's just focus on making camp before dark," Mark said before I could respond, not bothering to look back. The first hints of tension between my friends had appeared during our planning sessions. Dan wanted freedom to explore and photograph, while Mark insisted on a strict itinerary. I found myself playing mediator more often than I liked, a role I was all too familiar with from my failed marriage. As the sun continued its descent, the forest began to change. The friendly afternoon woods transformed into something more primeval. Shadows deepened, and the cheerful bird calls gave way to the occasional hoot of an early owl. The temperature dropped noticeably, and I pulled my jacket tighter around me. "Should be just ahead," Mark announced after we'd been hiking for over an hour. "There's a clearing near the creek bend that's perfect for camping." He was right. The clearing appeared as the trail curved alongside the creek, a flat area sheltered by tall oaks. We made camp efficiently, with Mark taking charge. Tents went up, a fire pit was dug, and a cooking area established. By the time darkness fell completely, we had a small fire going and were heating water for our freeze-dried meals. "First night in the wilderness," Dan said, raising his metal cup of instant coffee in a toast. "To adventure and getting away from it all." "To remembering what matters," Mark added, his usually stern face softening in the firelight. I raised my own cup. "To new beginnings." We ate in companionable silence, watching the flames dance and listening to the night sounds of the forest. Occasionally, something would rustle in the darkness beyond our firelight, but Mark assured us it was just deer or raccoons. "Nothing dangerous in these woods," he said confidently. "Black bears occasionally, but they're shy. Cougars are rare. Biggest danger out here is getting lost or injured." "Or locals," Dan added with a slight smirk. "Isn't this area known for meth labs and marijuana grows?" Mark shrugged. "That's mostly further south. This section of the forest is too remote even for that. Nearest access road is 8 miles back." That thought was both comforting and unsettling. No dangerous locals, but also no quick way out if something went wrong. As we prepared for bed, I noticed Mark checking the map again, his brow furrowed. "Everything okay?" I asked. He folded the map quickly. "Fine. Just confirming tomorrow's route. We've got a steep section to climb." I nodded, not entirely convinced, but too tired to press further. Inside my tent, I listened to the gentle sound of the creek and the occasional crack of the dying fire. Despite my exhaustion, sleep proved elusive. Every sound seemed amplified: the hoot of an owl, the rustle of leaves, the soft whisper of the wind, and, beneath it all, barely perceptible, something else. A rhythmic sound, almost like breathing. I told myself it was just Dan or Mark snoring in their tents, but the sound seemed to come from everywhere at once, as if the forest itself were breathing. Eventually, exhaustion won out, and I drifted into uneasy dreams of being watched by unseen eyes. "Rise and shine, city boy." Mark's voice pulled me from sleep. Light was filtering through my tent and my watch showed 6:30 a.m. I groaned, every muscle protesting as I sat up. One day of hiking, and I was already sore. This didn't bode well for the next 13 days. Breakfast was instant oatmeal and more coffee, consumed as we broke down our campsite. Dan was uncharacteristically quiet, his camera untouched beside his pack. "Everything okay?" I asked him while Mark was down at the creek filtering water. Dan glanced around before answering. "Did you hear anything strange last night?" The breathing sound immediately came to mind, but I hesitated. Like what? Like whispering, or someone walking around the camp. A chill ran down my spine despite the morning warmth. Probably just animals. "Yeah," Dan agreed too quickly. "Probably." Mark returned with full water bottles and we set off again, following the creek further into the forest. Today's hike would take us to the northern edge of the Hercules Glades Wilderness, one of the most remote areas in Missouri. The terrain grew more challenging as the morning progressed, the trail sometimes disappearing entirely, forcing Mark to navigate by map and compass. By midday, the friendly forest of yesterday had given way to something older and less welcoming. The trees here were massive, their canopies blocking most of the sunlight, creating a perpetual twilight beneath. Thick carpets of moss covered fallen logs, and the air held a damp, earthy smell. "This is incredible," Dan breathed, finally removing his camera to take pictures. "Some of these oaks must be hundreds of years old." Mark checked his map again, that same furrow appearing between his brows. "We should have reached the fork by now." "Are we lost?" I asked, trying to keep my voice light. "No," Mark said firmly. "Just not exactly where I expected. Let's keep going. The trail should reappear soon." But it didn't. As the afternoon wore on, we found ourselves pushing through increasingly dense undergrowth, with no sign of a human trail. The creek we'd been following had widened into a slow-moving river, its surface dark and opaque. Strange, considering we were supposed to be hiking away from the main waterway, not toward it. "We need to stop and reassess," I finally said after nearly 2 hours of bushwhacking. "This can't be right." Mark reluctantly agreed, and we found a small clearing to rest. As he spread his map on a fallen log, I noticed his hands were trembling slightly. Dan was scanning the forest, his camera forgotten again, a look of unease on his face. "I don't understand," Mark muttered, tracing our intended route with his finger. "We should be here, but the terrain doesn't match at all." "Could the map be wrong?" Dan suggested. Mark shot him an irritated look. "Military-grade topographical maps don't just get wrong, Dan. Then maybe your orienteering is off, Dan snapped back. Guys, I interjected, this isn't helping. What matters is figuring out where we are now and how to get back on track. Mark took a deep breath. You're right, let me check the GPS again. He pulled out his handheld GPS unit, an expensive model he'd insisted on bringing despite its added weight. After a moment, his frown deepened. No signal. Too much tree cover. That was when I noticed how quiet it had become. No birds called, no insects buzzed. Just the soft gurgle of the dark river and the sound of our own breathing. Listen, I said softly. They both fell silent, heads tilting. I don't hear anything, Dan whispered after a long moment. Exactly, I replied. It's too quiet. Mark's expression changed, the irritation giving way to professional concern. That's not good. Forests shouldn't go silent unless there's a predator nearby. We instinctively moved closer together, scanning the surrounding trees. We need to keep moving, Mark decided. Find higher ground. I can get a better fix on our position if we get above these trees. With no better option, we shouldered our packs and continued, now moving away from the river toward what Mark hoped was an elevated ridge. The going was tough. The forest floor uneven and covered with fallen branches and hidden holes that seemed designed to twist an ankle. As we hiked, I couldn't shake the feeling we were being watched. Several times I spun around, certain I'd catch someone or something following us, but there was never anything there. Just trees and shadows and that unnatural silence. The sunlight was fading fast when we finally reached higher ground, a rocky outcrop that rose above the forest canopy. From this vantage point, we could see for miles in every direction, an endless sea of trees with no sign of roads, buildings, or any human presence. Mark studied the view, then checked his GPS again. This time, he got a signal. "This can't be right," he muttered. "What?" Dan and I asked simultaneously. Mark held out the GPS, showing us the screen. According to the device, we were nearly 15 miles northwest of where we should be, in a section of the forest that wasn't even on our planned route. "That's impossible," I said. "We couldn't have hiked that far off course in a day." "The unit must be malfunctioning," Mark agreed, though he didn't sound convinced. As we stood there, the last light fading from the sky, I noticed something strange on the horizon, a faint orange glow that didn't match the sunset. "Is that fire?" I asked, pointing. Mark squinted in the direction I indicated. "I don't think so. Wrong color for a forest fire. Might be some kind of light from a structure. A building, out here." Dan sounded skeptical. "Could be a ranger station or a fire tower," Mark suggested. "Either way, it's the only sign of civilization we've seen. I say we head toward it tomorrow." With no better plan, we made camp on the rocky outcrop. The exposed position was less than ideal. The wind whipped across the rocks, chilling us despite our layers, but none of us wanted to return to the oppressive darkness of the forest below. We ate our freeze-dried meals in silence, each lost in our own thoughts. The stars emerged overhead, impossibly bright without light pollution, but I found no comfort in their cold, distant light. The mysterious orange glow remained visible on the horizon, neither growing nor diminishing. "I'll take first watch," Mark said as we prepared for sleep. Dan and I exchanged glances. "Watch? For what?" I asked. Mark's face was grim in the firelight. "Just a precaution, 4 hours each. I'll wake you at midnight, Jason. You wake Dan at 4. Too exhausted to argue, I retreated to my tent, zipping the sleeping bag up to my chin despite the stuffiness. This time, sleep came quickly, but it was far from restful. In my dreams, I wandered through an endless forest, following the sound of someone calling my name. The voice was familiar and strange all at once, sometimes sounding like Rebecca, other times like a voice I'd never heard before. As I moved toward it, I became aware of other figures moving through the trees alongside me, shadowy forms just beyond clear sight. They whispered to each other in a language I almost understood, discussing my fate in hushed, eager tones. I woke with a start to Mark shaking my shoulder. "Your watch," he whispered. Disoriented, I checked my watch. Midnight exactly. I crawled from my tent, still half in my nightmare, the cool air shocking me fully awake. Mark handed me his flashlight. "Don't leave the camp. Just stay alert. Wake me if you see or hear anything unusual." "Like what?" I whispered back. He hesitated. "Just anything that doesn't belong." With that cryptic warning, he disappeared into his tent, leaving me alone with the dying fire and the vast night. I added a few small branches to the embers, watching as the flames caught and grew. The meager heat did little to dispel the chill that had settled into my bones. I paced the perimeter of our small camp, flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. Beyond the outcrop, the forest sprawled in all directions, now a solid mass of blackness. The orange glow we'd spotted earlier was still visible, perhaps slightly brighter than before. 2 hours into my watch, I heard it, a sound that froze the blood in my veins. From somewhere in the forest below came a long, mournful howl. Not a wolf or a coyote. I knew those sounds. This was something else entirely. Almost human, but distorted, like a person trying to mimic an animal call. It rose and fell in pitch, ending in a series of short, barking cries that made the hair on my arms stand on end. I stood paralyzed, flashlight beam fixed on the point where the sound had originated. Nothing moved in the darkness below, but the feeling of being watched intensified. The howl came again, this time from a different direction. Then another answered from somewhere else. They were calling to each other, communicating, and they were surrounding our position. I should have woken Mark immediately, but some primal instinct kept me rooted in place, afraid that any movement would draw attention. The calls continued, growing closer until they seemed to come from just beyond the edge of our outcrop. Then, in my peripheral vision, I caught movement, a figure at the edge of the firelight. I swung my flashlight toward it, heart pounding. For a split second, the beam illuminated what appeared to be a person crouched on all fours, body distorted in ways that didn't seem possible, skin a pale gray in the harsh light. Then it was gone, scuttling back into the darkness with inhuman speed. I stumbled backward, nearly falling into the fire. This time, I didn't hesitate. I rushed to Mark's tent, calling his name in a harsh whisper. He emerged immediately, fully dressed, knife already in hand. "What is it?" I explained what I'd seen and heard, my words tumbling over each other. To my surprise, Mark didn't seem shocked or disbelieving. Instead, he nodded grimly, as if I'd confirmed something he already suspected. "Wake Dan," he ordered. "Quietly, tell him to pack up. We're leaving." "Now? In the dark?" "Now," Mark confirmed. "It's not safe here." I moved to Dan's tent, shaking him awake as gently as possible while conveying urgency. He blinked at me in confusion as I relayed Mark's instructions. "What's going on?" he mumbled, still half asleep. "I don't know exactly, but there's something out there. Multiple somethings. We need to move." That got his attention. We packed our gear with frantic efficiency, keeping our voices to whispers. The howls had stopped, but the silence was somehow worse, filled with anticipation. Mark was studying his map and GPS by the dim light of his headlamp. "There's an old fire road about 3 miles north of here," he said. "If we can reach it, we might be able to follow it out to a main road." "And if we can't?" Dan asked, voicing the fear we all felt. Mark didn't answer, just shouldered his pack. "Stay close, single file. I'll lead. Jason in the middle, Dan bring up the rear. Keep your headlamps on low power. We need to see, but we don't want to advertise our position more than necessary." With that, he headed toward the narrow path that led down from the outcrop. Dan and I exchanged a glance before following, the unspoken question hanging between us. What did Mark know that we didn't? Descending in the dark was treacherous. The path was steep and covered with loose rocks that shifted underfoot. Several times one of us slipped, only saved from falling by grabbing onto scrubby trees that grew from the rock face. By the time we reached the forest floor, my hands were scraped raw, and my knees ached from the constant tension. The forest, that had been so unnaturally silent earlier, now seemed alive with sounds. Rustling leaves, snapping twigs, and, occasionally, that same eerie howling call, always at a distance but following our progress. Mark set a punishing pace, pushing us through the undergrowth with minimal reference to his map or GPS. He seemed to be navigating by some internal compass, drawn toward something only he could perceive. After what felt like hours of hiking, but was probably less than one according to my watch, we emerged into a small clearing. In the center stood a dilapidated cabin, its roof partially collapsed, windows dark, empty sockets. Despite its state of disrepair, there was something deliberately threatening about it, as if it had been placed in our path as a warning. Mark halted at the edge of the clearing, studying the cabin with narrowed eyes. "We go around," he decided. "Stay in the trees, keep the cabin in sight, but don't approach it." "Shouldn't we check if there's anyone there who could help?" Dan suggested, his voice barely above a whisper. Mark shot him a look that silenced further discussion. "Trust me, we go around." We skirted the clearing, keeping to the trees as instructed. As we passed the front of the cabin, I noticed something I hadn't seen from our initial vantage point. The door was open, swinging gently though there was no breeze. Just inside, barely visible in the darkness, stood what appeared to be a collection of objects hanging from the ceiling. Small bundles of sticks, feathers, and other materials I couldn't identify. "Mark," I hissed, pointing. He glanced at the cabin, his face hardening. "Keep moving. Don't look at it." But Dan had already stopped, camera in hand, the photographer in him overriding his fear. "What are those things? Some kind of folk art?" "Dan, now is not the time," Mark growled, but Dan was already raising his camera, the lens pointed toward the open door. The flash illuminated the interior of the cabin for a split second, revealing the hanging objects in stark detail. Not just sticks and feathers, but bones. Animal skulls, jawbones, vertebrae, all arranged in complex patterns. And on the back wall, painted in what looked horribly like dried blood, a crude symbol, a humanoid figure with elongated limbs and an oversized head, surrounded by smaller figures in attitudes of worship. "What the hell?" Dan breathed, lowering his camera. That's when we heard it. A low, guttural growl from inside the cabin. The door swung wider, revealing nothing but impenetrable darkness beyond. "Run," Mark said, his voice deadly calm. "Now." We ran, crashing through the underbrush with no attempt at stealth, our headlamps bobbing wildly, creating a disorienting strobe effect against the trees. Behind us came sounds of pursuit, branches snapping, leaves rustling, and those same inhuman howls, now filled with excitement. I had no idea how long we ran or in what direction. All sense of orientation was lost in the panic of flight. My lungs burned and my legs felt like lead, but primal fear kept me moving, kept me close on Mark's heels as he forged ahead. The forest suddenly thinned, and we found ourselves on what appeared to be an old, overgrown road, little more than 2 dirt tracks with grass growing between them, but unmistakably man-made. "The fire road," Mark gasped, bent double and breathing hard. "We made it." Dan collapsed onto the ground, chest heaving. I remained standing, though my legs trembled with exhaustion, peering back the way we had come. The sounds of pursuit had faded, but I didn't trust the silence. "What were those things?" I asked when I could finally speak. "What was that cabin?" Mark straightened, wiping sweat from his face. "Local legend calls them wilderness watchers. Supposed to be some kind of forest spirits or demons that protect certain areas from human intrusion. Most serious hikers around here consider them campfire stories." "That didn't feel like a campfire story," Dan said bitterly. "No," Mark agreed. "It didn't." "You knew," I accused, sudden anger cutting through my fear. "You knew about them, about the cabin, About all of it. That's why you weren't surprised when I woke you." Mark had the decency to look guilty. I'd heard stories. Didn't believe them, not really. But there've been disappearances in this part of the forest over the years. Hikers who vanished without a trace, some found months later in places they shouldn't have been. Their bodies. He trailed off. "Their bodies what?" Dan demanded. "Changed," Mark finished reluctantly. Reports described them as distorted, like they'd been twisted somehow. Officials blamed animal attacks, exposure, decomposition, natural explanations. "Why didn't you tell us before we came out here?" I asked, struggling to keep my voice level. "Would you have believed me? Besides, those areas were supposedly much further south. We shouldn't have ended up anywhere near them." He gestured helplessly at the GPS. "Something's wrong with our navigation. Maybe magnetic anomalies, maybe—" He didn't finish the thought. "So, what now?" Dan asked, finally standing up and brushing dirt from his clothes. Mark pointed down the overgrown road. "We follow this out. It has to connect to a main road eventually." "And if those things follow us?" I asked. "They seem territorial. Now that we're on the road, we might be outside their domain." He didn't sound entirely convinced. With no better options, we set off along the fire road, our pace slower now but steady. My watch showed 3:47 a.m., hours until dawn. The road wound through the forest, sometimes narrowing to little more than a path before widening again. In places, tree roots had buckled the surface, and fallen logs created obstacles we had to climb over. As we walked, the orange glow we'd seen from the outcrop grew brighter and clearer. It was definitely not a forest fire or a building. The light had a pulsing quality, almost like a heartbeat, and it seemed to emanate from a specific point in the forest ahead of us. "What is that?" Dan wondered aloud, his camera hanging forgotten at his side. Mark shook his head. "I don't know, but it's in the direction we need to go." The fire road curved toward the light as if drawn to it. As we followed the bend, the trees opened up to reveal the source, a circular clearing perhaps 50 yards across, at the center of which burned what appeared to be a massive bonfire. Around it moved figures, their forms distorted by the heat haze and distance. We crouched at the edge of the road, concealed by underbrush, watching. The figures were human-shaped but moved in a strange, lurching gait, as if their joints worked differently. They circled the fire rhythmically, following some pattern only they understood. "Some kind of ritual," Mark whispered. "We need to go around." But the road led directly past the clearing, with dense forest on either side. Going around would mean leaving our only path out, potentially getting lost again in territory we now knew was hostile. "Maybe we should wait until dawn," I suggested. "They might leave when the sun comes up." Mark considered this, then nodded reluctantly. "We'll find cover and wait. But at first light, we move, whether they're gone or not." We retreated a short distance back down the road, finding a dense thicket that offered concealment while still allowing us to monitor the clearing. As we settled in to wait, I checked my phone out of habit, not expecting any signal. To my shock, I had 1 bar of service. "Guys," I hissed, holding up the phone, "I've got signal." Mark and Dan crowded close, staring at the screen as if it were a mirage that might vanish. "Call for help," Dan urged. "Park rangers, police, anyone." I dialed 911 with trembling fingers, pressing the phone hard against my ear to catch any sound. It rang once, twice, then connected, but instead of a dispatcher, I heard only a strange, rhythmic chanting, similar to the howls we'd heard earlier but more structured, almost like speech. I pulled the phone away, staring at it in horror. The call was connected, the timer counting seconds, but what I was hearing wasn't coming from any emergency services. Mark took the phone from my unresisting hand, listened for a moment, then ended the call, his face grim. "They're tapped into everything," he said quietly. "They know we're here." As if to confirm his words, the chanting from the clearing grew louder, and the figures around the fire stopped their circular movement, all turning to face in our direction. Then, as one, they began to move toward us. "Run," Mark ordered for the second time that night. "Back the way we came. Find a place to hide until dawn." We fled down the fire road, the sounds of pursuit close behind us. The lurching figures from the clearing moved with surprising speed, gaining on us with every step. My lungs burned, and my legs felt like they might give out at any moment, but terror kept me moving. Ahead, the road forked, one branch continuing straight while another smaller path veered off to the right. Mark hesitated for only a second before choosing the smaller path. "This way." The path led us deeper into the forest, eventually ending at what appeared to be an abandoned quarry, a deep, bowl-shaped depression with sheer rock walls on three sides. At the bottom lay a small black pool of water, its surface perfectly still and reflective in the faint moonlight. "We're trapped," Dan gasped, staring at the rock walls that rose at least 30 feet on every side except the one we'd entered from. Mark was already scanning the quarry. "There," he pointed to a dark opening in the rock face opposite us. "That looks like a cave entrance. We can hide there until dawn." We scrambled down the steep slope to the quarry floor, circling the ominous pool to reach the cave. Up close, it was smaller than it had appeared from above. A narrow fissure in the rock face, barely wide enough for a person to squeeze through. "I'll go first," Mark said, turning on his headlamp and peering into the darkness. "Stay right behind me." The passage was claustrophobically tight, forcing us to move sideways in places, the rough stone scraping against my back and chest. The air inside was cold and carried a strange, metallic smell that tickled the back of my throat. Mark's headlamp illuminated only a few feet ahead, the beam swallowed by the absolute darkness beyond. After what felt like an eternity of shuffling forward, the passage widened into a small chamber. Mark's light swept the space, revealing smooth stone walls covered in what appeared to be ancient drawings, crude depictions of human figures with elongated limbs and oversized heads, eerily similar to the symbol we'd seen in the cabin. "Mark," I said, my voice echoing strangely in the confined space. "These drawings—" "I see them," he replied tersely. "Keep moving. There's another passage on the far side." The second passage was even narrower than the first, forcing us to crawl on hands and knees in places. The stone was damp here, slick with some unidentifiable moisture that soaked through my pants and gloves. The metallic smell grew stronger, and with it came another odor, the unmistakable copper penny scent of blood. The passage finally opened into a much larger chamber, so vast that our headlamps couldn't illuminate the ceiling or far walls. The floor was relatively flat but covered in small, dark pools similar to the one outside in the quarry. Their surfaces reflected our lights like black mirrors, creating disorienting flashes as we moved. "What is this place?" Dan whispered, his voice tight with fear. Mark didn't answer, his attention fixed on something ahead of us. Following his gaze, I saw what had captured his attention. At the center of the chamber stood a rough stone altar, and upon it lay what appeared to be a human body. We approached cautiously, our lights revealing more details with each step. The body was that of a man, perhaps in his 50s, dressed in hiking clothes not unlike our own, though they were torn and stained with what could only be blood. His chest had been opened, the skin peeled back to reveal an empty cavity where his organs should have been. Dan made a choking sound, turning away to vomit. I couldn't tear my eyes away from the horrific sight, especially when I noticed the man's face. His eyes were open, and his features were frozen in an expression of such terror it seemed impossible that he had been dead when this was done to him. "We need to leave," Mark said, his voice barely audible. "Now." But as we turned to retrace our steps, we heard it, the sound of movement from the passage we'd entered through, the rhythmic scrape of something pulling itself along the narrow tunnel, punctuated by those same guttural howls we'd heard in the forest. "They've followed us," Dan moaned, backing away from the passage entrance. Mark's headlamp swept the chamber, searching for another way out. "There," he pointed to what appeared to be another fissure in the far wall. "That might lead somewhere. It's our only chance." We ran, splashing through the black pools, each step sending ripples across their mirror-like surfaces. Behind us, the sounds from the passage grew louder, accompanied now by a strange chittering that echoed throughout the chamber. The new fissure was barely visible, just a slightly darker shadow against the black rock. As we approached, I realized with growing horror that it wasn't a passage at all, just a shallow indentation in the rock, offering no escape. "We're trapped," I said, the words barely making it past the constriction in my throat. Mark's face was ashen in the harsh light of our headlamps. "Form a circle," he ordered, drawing the hunting knife from his belt. "Backs together. Whatever comes through that passage, we face it together." We stood in the shallow alcove, shoulders touching, watching the passage entrance across the chamber. The sounds grew louder, now accompanied by the scrape of claws on stone. Then they emerged. 3 figures crawling from the passage on all fours, moving with a terrible fluid grace that no human could match. In the dim light of our headlamps, I could see they had once been human, but were now changed, transformed. Their limbs were elongated, joints bent at impossible angles. Their skin was a pallid gray, stretched tight over distorted bones. But worst were their faces. Still recognizably human, yet altered, the jaws extended and filled with needle-like teeth, eyes sunken and entirely black. They paused just outside the passage, heads swiveling as they scanned the chamber. Then, as one, they fixed their gaze on us and began to move forward, still on all fours but with increasing speed. "Daniel, the flash!" Mark barked. "Blind them!" Dan raised his camera with shaking hands and triggered the flash repeatedly. The bright bursts illuminated the entire chamber in stark, strobing light, revealing dozens of similar creatures clinging to the walls and ceiling, momentarily frozen by the unexpected brightness. The creatures on the ground faltered, emitting high-pitched shrieks of pain or anger. Mark seized the opportunity, pushing us back toward the passage entrance. "Go, while they're disoriented." We ran, splashing through the black pools again, Dan continuing to trigger his camera flash every few steps. The creatures recovered quickly, giving chase with terrifying speed, their howls echoing through the chamber. We reached the passage and squeezed in one after another. Dan going first, then me, with Mark bringing up the rear. The narrow confines that had seemed so claustrophobic before now offered a slim hope. The creatures, with their distorted bodies, might not be able to follow as easily. This hope was short-lived. As we crawled frantically through the passage, I heard Mark cry out behind me. Glancing back, I saw him kicking at something that had grabbed his leg, a pale, elongated hand with too many joints, its fingers wrapped around his ankle. "Keep going," Mark shouted, slashing at the hand with his knife. "Don't stop." I hesitated for only a second before continuing, shame burning alongside fear in my chest. Ahead of me, Dan had already reached the first chamber and was entering the passage that would lead back to the quarry. I emerged into the chamber just as Mark's screams began in earnest. Terrible, agonized sounds that echoed through the stone chamber, growing more distorted and less human with each passing second. I froze, torn between the primal instinct to flee and the obligation to help my friend. "Jason, come on!" Dan shouted from the next passage, his face a pale oval of terror in the darkness. Mark's screams abruptly changed, transforming into something that resembled the howling cries of the creatures. The decision was made for me. Whatever was happening to Mark, it was already too late. I scrambled into the next passage, my hands and knees scraped raw against the rough stone, the sounds of pursuit close behind. Dan was already halfway through, moving with desperate speed. We burst from the cave entrance into the quarry, the pre-dawn sky a deep indigo above us. The black pool at the center of the quarry floor was no longer still. Its surface rippled and bulged, as if something beneath was trying to break through. "Up the slope," Dan gasped, already scrambling toward the incline we'd descended earlier. The climb was treacherous. Loose stones sliding beneath our feet, sending small avalanches down behind us. The sounds from the cave had changed. no longer pursuit, but a rhythmic chanting similar to what we'd heard through my phone. It grew louder, more insistent, seeming to vibrate through the very rock beneath our hands. We reached the top just as the first rays of sunlight crested the eastern ridge, painting the forest in pale gold. Below us, the black pool in the quarry began to boil, great bubbles of darkness breaking its surface. From the cave entrance emerged not the creatures we'd seen before, but a single figure that was unmistakably Mark, or what had once been Mark. His body had been twisted, elongated in ways that human anatomy shouldn't allow. His skin had taken on that same pallid gray tone, and his face, I will never forget his face. His jaw hung open too wide, filled with jagged teeth, but his eyes were the worst part. They were still Mark's eyes, still human, filled with awareness and unspeakable agony. He raised a distorted arm, pointing directly at us with fingers that now resembled claws. From his malformed throat came a terrible sound. My name, but stretched and warped, as if his new form couldn't quite remember how to shape human speech. "Run," Dan whispered, tugging at my arm. "For God's sake. Jason, run." We fled along the small path that had led us to the quarry, the morning light gradually strengthening around us. Behind, the chanting continued, though it seemed to fade with distance. Whether the creatures couldn't or wouldn't follow us into daylight, I didn't know, but I thanked whatever gods might be listening for this small mercy. We reached the fire road again, turning in the direction that led away from the clearing with the bonfire. The road seemed different in daylight, narrower, less defined, in places nearly reclaimed by the forest. But it was still our best hope for finding our way out. We walked in silence for what felt like hours, each lost in our own thoughts, the horror of what had happened to Mark too fresh to discuss. The sun climbed higher, burning away the morning mist, revealing a forest that seemed almost offensively normal in the daylight. Birds sang, squirrels chattered, insects buzzed among wildflowers that dotted the roadside. Around mid-morning, the fire road intersected with a wider, more maintained gravel road. We followed it without discussion, both understanding that any sign of human presence was our best chance at survival. The gravel road eventually led to a small, rural highway where miraculously we managed to flag down a passing truck. The driver, an elderly man with a weathered face and suspicious eyes, reluctantly agreed to take us to the nearest town after we concocted a story about getting separated from our friend during a day hike. "You boys came from the North Trail?" he asked, eyeing us in his rearview mirror. "Don't many folks go up that way no more, not since them disappearances started." Dan and I exchanged glances but said nothing, too exhausted and traumatized to engage. The old man seemed to take our silence as confirmation of something. "Them woods ain't natural," he continued almost to himself. "Something in 'em that don't want people around. Old-timers call 'em the Watchers. Say they been there since before white men came, guardians of something buried deep. Indians wouldn't go near certain parts, especially that old quarry." My blood ran cold at the mention of the quarry. "You know about the quarry?" I asked, my voice hoarse. The old man nodded, eyes fixed on the road ahead. "Used to be a limestone operation back in the 1920s, till they broke into something they shouldn't have. 5 men went missing in one night. They sealed it up, abandoned the whole operation. But things still get out sometimes, especially when folks go poking around where they don't belong." He fell silent after that, and neither Dan nor I pressed for more information. We reached the small town of Elsinore just before noon, where the truck driver dropped us at a local diner with a gruff warning to stay out of them woods. Inside the diner, fueled by hot coffee and the greasy comfort of bacon and eggs, Dan and I finally had to face the reality of what had happened. "We need to report this," Dan said, his voice low despite the near-empty diner. "Tell the police, the park rangers, someone." I laughed, a hollow sound that held no humor. "And tell them what? That our friend was taken by forest monsters? That he's been transformed into something inhuman? They'll think we killed him and made up a crazy story to cover it." "Then what do we do?" Dan demanded, his face haggard with exhaustion and grief. Just forget about Mark? Pretend none of this happened? I had no answer. The waitress refilled our coffee cups, eyeing our dirty, scratched appearance with undisguised curiosity. "You boys look like you had quite a night," she commented. "Got lost hiking," I replied automatically. "Our friend, we got separated." She nodded sympathetically. "Happens sometimes in those woods. Not all who wander in come wandering out." She said it casually, as if discussing the weather, but there was something knowing in her eyes that made my skin crawl. After breakfast, we used the diner's phone to call for a taxi to take us back to our car at the original trailhead. Neither of us mentioned the possibility of reporting Mark's disappearance, the unspoken agreement hanging between us that some truths were too bizarre, too horrific to be spoken aloud. The taxi driver, unlike the truck driver and waitress, was a young man who had recently moved to the area and knew nothing of local legends. He chatted amicably about hunting and fishing as he drove us through the rolling Missouri landscape, carefully skirting the edges of Mark Twain National Forest. Our car was still at the trailhead, untouched though covered in a fine layer of dust and pollen. Seeing it was like encountering an artifact from another lifetime. Had it really been only 2 days since we'd parked here, full of excitement for our wilderness adventure? As Dan drove us back toward St. Louis, I stared out the window at the passing forest, searching the shadows between trees for movement, for distorted figures watching our departure. I saw nothing, but the weight of unseen eyes pressed against me nonetheless. "What do we tell people?" Dan finally asked, breaking the hours-long silence. "About Mark." I considered this. Mark had no family. His parents were dead, and he'd never married or had children. His army buddies might eventually wonder why he'd stopped calling, and his absence from work would be noticed. But there was no one who would immediately sound an alarm. We say he went off on his own, I decided, wanted to extend his hike, said he'd meet us back in civilization in a week or two. If he doesn't show up... I trailed off, unwilling to complete the thought. Dan nodded slowly, eyes fixed on the road ahead. "And when they search for him, they won't find anything," I said with certainty. "Whatever's happening in those woods, it's been happening for a long time. The locals know to stay away. The authorities probably have their own explanations for the disappearances." We lapsed back into silence, each lost in our own thoughts. I knew we were complicit in something terrible by not reporting what had happened, but self-preservation overrode guilt. No one would believe our story. At best, we'd be considered crazy. At worst, suspected of murder. Back in St. Louis, Dan dropped me at my apartment with a brief, awkward goodbye. We both knew that our friendship, bound now by shared trauma and unspoken secrets, would never be the same. Some experiences create connections too painful to maintain. That night, alone in my apartment, I finally allowed myself to break down, sobbing until my throat was raw, the images of Mark's transformed body playing on endless loop behind my eyelids. When exhaustion finally claimed me, my dreams were filled with dark forests and echoing caves, and the constant sense of being watched by something ancient and hungry. I woke to the sound of my phone ringing. Dan, his voice tight with barely controlled panic. "Jason, check your camera roll." "What? Why?" "Just do it," he insisted. "Right now." I pulled my phone from the charger, opening the photo app with dread pooling in my stomach. There, in my recent photos, was an image I had no memory of taking. A blurry shot of what appeared to be a bonfire in a forest clearing surrounded by distorted figures. In the foreground, just barely in focus, was a face I recognized with horror. Mark's face, but wrong, changed, his mouth stretched in an impossible grin, eyes black pits in the firelight. "I didn't take this," I whispered, though I knew Dan couldn't see me shaking my head. "I never took this picture." "I know," Dan replied, his voice trembling. "I have one too. Different image, same things. And I just got a text from Mark's number." My blood ran cold. What did it say? "We're coming for you both. You've seen. You belong to us now." I ended the call without responding, my mind racing. Mark's phone had been in his backpack when we fled the cave. For anyone, or anything, to be using it now meant they had found his belongings. And if they had his phone, they had our numbers. They knew who we were. Over the next week, the texts continued. Sometimes words, sometimes just images that defied explanation. Glimpses of things that shouldn't exist in our reality. Dan and I spoke daily, comparing notes, trying to convince ourselves that it was just some sick prankster who had found Mark's phone in the forest. But we both knew better. The messages contained details no stranger could know. References to conversations we'd had in our tents, descriptions of our deepest fears that we'd never shared with anyone. And always, always, the promise, "We're coming for you." 10 days after our return, Dan stopped answering his phone. After 24 hours of increasingly frantic calls and texts, I drove to his apartment, a sense of dread building with each mile. His door was unlocked. Inside, everything appeared normal at first glance. No signs of struggle, no overturned furniture or broken windows. But Dan was gone, and on his computer screen was a single open document containing 3 words: "The Woods Call." I reported his disappearance to the police, of course. They took my statement, noted that 2 men going missing in such a short time was concerning, and promised to investigate. But I could see in their eyes that they suspected a more mundane explanation. Perhaps drugs, or debt, or some other trouble that would eventually reveal itself. I didn't mention the texts or the strange photos. I didn't tell them about the creatures in the forest or the cave with its ancient drawings and black pools. Such truths have no place in the orderly world of police reports and rational explanations. That was 3 months ago. I haven't returned to my apartment since finding Dan's note. Instead, I've been moving from motel to motel, paying cash, using false names, trying to stay one step ahead of whatever is hunting me. I know it's only a matter of time before they find me. The texts have continued, now from both Mark's and Dan's numbers, growing more frequent, more insistent. Last night I woke to find my motel room door standing open, though I distinctly remembered engaging both the lock and the security chain. On the bathroom mirror, written in what looked horribly like dried blood, were the words, "The forest needs you, Jason." I fled before dawn, driving aimlessly until I found this small roadside diner with its weak coffee and unreliable Wi-Fi. I'm writing this account now not in hopes of saving myself, I know that's impossible, but as a warning to others. There are places in this world that don't belong to humanity, ancient territories we've encroached upon but never truly claimed. And there are things in those places that see us not as explorers or conquerors, but as resources to be harvested, clay to be remolded. I've booked a flight to Alaska, as far from Missouri as I can reasonably get. I don't expect it to save me. Whatever is hunting me doesn't seem constrained by normal physical limitations, but perhaps I can buy some time, find some way to fight back or at least understand what I'm facing. If you're reading this and I've gone missing, don't look for me. Don't try to solve the mystery of what happened to me or my friends. And most importantly, stay out of the deep woods of Mark Twain National Forest, especially the areas around Hercules Glades and Beaver Creek. Some places don't want to be explored, some things should remain undisturbed, and some mysteries, once glimpsed, will never let you go. My phone just buzzed with a new text. It's from my own number, though I'm holding my phone in my hand. The message contains just 4 words. "We're right behind you." I'm afraid to turn around. My name is Laura Adams, and I am 34 years old. This happened in the remote wilderness of Hercules Glades in Mark Twain National Forest, Missouri, during what was supposed to be a simple week-long hiking and camping trip to clear my mind after my recent job loss. The forest seemed to welcome me at first. The towering oak and hickory trees created a natural cathedral, their leaves rustling in the gentle breeze like whispered greetings. I had always found solace in nature, but after being unexpectedly laid off from my position as a research analyst at a pharmaceutical company in St. Louis, I needed more than just a weekend getaway. I needed time to process what had happened and figure out my next steps. The Hercules Glades Wilderness area was perfect, remote enough to offer true solitude, but with well-marked trails and established camping areas. I had mapped out a 6-day trek that would take me through some of the most scenic parts of the wilderness: Long Creek, the Falls, Coy Bald, and finally looping back to where I'd parked at the Tower Trailhead. April in the Ozarks meant mild temperatures, wildflowers beginning to bloom, and relatively few other hikers. The first 2 days unfolded exactly as planned. I hiked at a leisurely pace, stopping frequently to photograph interesting fungi, unusual rock formations, or particularly beautiful vistas. The physical exertion helped quiet my racing thoughts, and by the second evening, as I set up camp near a small stream, I felt more at peace than I had in weeks. That night, I built a small fire, cooked a simple meal of dehydrated pasta, and sat watching the flames dance while planning my route for the next day. According to my map, I would be heading into a more remote section of the wilderness, an area locally known as Whispering Hollow. The name had intrigued me when I was researching this trip. Supposedly, it came from the way the wind moved through the narrow valley, creating sounds that early settlers had found unsettling. I should have paid more attention to those stories. The third day began with a light mist hanging over the forest, giving everything an ethereal quality. I broke camp early, eager to reach Whispering Hollow by midday. The trail became less distinct as I moved deeper into the wilderness, occasionally disappearing altogether beneath fallen leaves or crossing rocky areas where I had to carefully look for cairns or trailblazes to stay on course. Around noon, the forest began to change subtly. The trees grew closer together, their trunks darker and gnarled in ways that seemed almost deliberate, as if they had twisted themselves to block easy passage. The underbrush thickened, thorny vines grabbing at my clothes and skin. Even the quality of light shifted, the dappled sunlight taking on a greenish tinge as it filtered through the dense canopy. I consulted my map and GPS to confirm I was still on the right path. The signal was weak, but it showed I was heading in the correct direction. According to my calculations, I should reach the entrance to Whispering Hollow within the hour. It was just past 1 o'clock when I first heard it. A sound so faint I initially thought it was just the wind through the trees. A soft, rhythmic whispering that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. I stopped to listen more carefully. The sound had a pattern to it, almost like words spoken too softly to make out. "Hello?" I called out, wondering if there might be other hikers nearby. My voice sounded muffled, as if the air itself was absorbing the sound. No response. Just that persistent, soft whispering. I continued forward, the trail descending steadily now. The terrain grew increasingly rugged, requiring my full attention to navigate safely. The whispering ebbed and flowed, sometimes fading entirely, only to return louder when I stopped to rest or check my bearings. By mid-afternoon, I realized I had entered Whispering Hollow proper. The trail had led me into a narrow valley flanked by steep limestone bluffs. A small stream trickled along the valley floor, its water running clear over smooth stones. In other circumstances, I would have found it breathtakingly beautiful. But something felt off. The air was too still, the forest too quiet apart from that persistent whispering. No birds called, no insects buzzed. Even the stream seemed to flow silently. I had planned to make camp in the hollow, at a spot marked on my map as suitable for overnight stays. But as I moved deeper into the valley, every instinct told me this was not a place to spend the night. The whispering grew more insistent, and now I could almost make out words. My name, perhaps. Fragments of sentences that dissolved back into meaningless sounds when I tried to focus on them. My unease growing, I decided to push through the hollow and find a campsite on the other side, even if it meant hiking longer than I'd planned. I quickened my pace, trying to ignore the whispers that now seemed to follow directly behind me, so close I could almost feel breath on the back of my neck. The hollow narrowed further, the bluffs on either side closing in like the walls of a funnel. The stream disappeared underground, and the trail became a faint suggestion through increasingly dense vegetation. I had to use my trekking poles to push aside thick curtains of vines that seemed to reattach themselves behind me. That's when I saw it. A small cabin tucked against the base of the eastern bluff, almost hidden by the surrounding vegetation. It wasn't marked on my map, and its presence was jarring in what was supposed to be protected wilderness. The structure looked old, its rough-hewn logs weathered to a silvery gray, the small windows dark and empty. I stopped, uncertain. On one hand, the cabin might offer shelter and a safer place to spend the night than camping in the open hollow. On the other hand, its unexpected presence amplified my growing sense that something wasn't right about this place. As I stood deliberating, the whispering suddenly ceased. The silence that followed was more unnerving than the sounds had been. "Hello," I called out again, louder this time. "Is anyone there?" My voice seemed swallowed by the heavy air. Making a decision, I approached the cabin cautiously. As I drew closer, I noticed details that increased my unease. Strange symbols carved into the doorframe. A collection of what appeared to be small animal skulls hanging from the low eaves. Dark stains on the wooden steps leading to the porch. I stopped at the foot of those steps, fighting conflicting impulses. Professional curiosity urged me forward. After all, I was a researcher by nature and training, and this unexpected structure in the wilderness presented a mystery. But an older, more primal part of my brain screamed danger. Before I could decide whether to retreat or investigate further, the cabin door creaked open a few inches. No one appeared in the doorway. "Is someone there?" I asked, my hand instinctively moving to the knife on my belt. "I'm just passing through. I don't mean to trespass." A soft voice drifted from the darkened interior, an old woman's voice, quavering slightly. "Come in, dear. Night's coming, and it's not safe in the hollow after dark." Something about the voice made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. It sounded wrong, somehow. Too rehearsed, perhaps, like someone trying to remember how to sound human. "That's very kind," I replied, taking a step backward instead of forward. "But I need to continue on. I'm expected at the next trailhead tomorrow." A lie, but it felt important to suggest someone would miss me. The door opened wider, though I still couldn't see anyone inside. Ain't no way out of the hollow before nightfall, girl. The trails, they twist to something fierce after sunset. Maps don't work right, GPS signals die. The voice hardened slightly. "You come in now, I won't offer twice." My heart hammered against my ribs. Everything about this situation felt dangerous, but I couldn't identify any specific threat beyond the unsettling voice and the strange cabin. "Thank you for the warning," I said, taking another step back. "I'll make camp nearby and continue in the morning." A dry chuckle emanated from the darkness. "Suit yourself, they always do." The door slammed shut with such force that dust puffed from between the logs. I retreated quickly, putting as much distance between myself and the cabin as possible while still following what remained of the trail. The whispering returned, louder now and more urgent, though still unintelligible. The hollow was growing darker as the sun dropped behind the western bluff. I needed to find a place to camp, and soon. After about 15 minutes of rapid hiking, I spotted a small clearing about 30 feet off the trail. It wasn't ideal, closer to the bluff than I would have liked, with less visibility than I preferred, but it would have to do. I quickly set up my tent, gathered some firewood, and created a small fire ring. As darkness fell in earnest, I managed to get a fire started, its warm light creating a bubble of normalcy in the increasingly oppressive hollow. As I prepared a simple dinner, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Every few minutes I would shine my headlamp toward the surrounding forest, but saw nothing but trees and underbrush. The whispering had stopped again, which should have been reassuring but somehow wasn't. After eating, I sat by the fire, trying to distract myself by planning the next day's hike. I would leave at first light, push through the remainder of the hollow, and hopefully reach more open terrain by mid-morning. The map showed the trail climbing out of the valley about 2 miles ahead, leading to a ridge with views of the surrounding wilderness. A twig snapped in the darkness beyond my campsite. I jerked my head up, flashing my light in the direction of the sound. Nothing. "Hello?" I called, trying to keep my voice steady. "Is someone there?" The forest absorbed my words without echo. More sounds followed. The rustle of leaves, another twig breaking, something moving through the underbrush just beyond the reach of my light. I stood up, knife in one hand, flashlight in the other. "I know you're there," I said, sounding braver than I felt. "Show yourself." A low chuckle, the same dry sound I'd heard from the cabin, though now it seemed to come from the opposite direction. "Brave little thing, aren't you?" The voice was closer now, no longer muffled by walls. "Most of them cower in their tents by now." A figure stepped into the edge of the firelight, an elderly woman, so thin she appeared almost two-dimensional when viewed from the side. She wore a long, shabby dress that might once have been blue but had faded to an indeterminate gray. Her white hair hung in tangled strands around a deeply lined face dominated by pale, almost colorless eyes. "Who are you?" I asked, knife still raised. "What do you want?" She tilted her head at an angle that seemed just slightly wrong, as if her neck contained too many vertebrae. "Name's Esther Blackwood. This is my hollow." Her thin lips curved in what might have been intended as a smile. As for what I want, just being neighborly, checking on the visitor. "I didn't see your cabin on any maps," I said. "I thought this was National Forest land." Esther's smile widened, revealing teeth that seemed too numerous and sharp for a human mouth. "Maps lie. Men lie. The forest remembers." She took a step closer. "You shouldn't have come here, Laura Adams." Ice flooded my veins. I hadn't told her my name. "How do you know who I am?" I demanded, fighting to keep my voice from shaking. "The hollow whispers," she said simply. "Tells me things. Like how you lost your job, how no one expects you back for days, how no one will look for you when you don't return." My mind raced. Had I encountered this woman somewhere before? Could she have overheard me talking to myself? Was there information in my campsite that could have revealed my identity? "What do you want?" I repeated, adjusting my grip on the knife. Esther's gaze flicked to the blade, then back to my face. "Put that away, girl. If I meant you harm, you'd already be bleeding." She gestured toward the log I'd been sitting on. "May I?" Without waiting for permission, she sat, extending gnarled hands toward the fire. Her movements were fluid, almost predatory, belying her apparent age. Against my better judgment, I sat as well, keeping the fire between us. "Why are you out here alone? Is the cabin yours?" "Been here longer than the cabin," she said cryptically. "Longer than the trail. Longer than the name they gave this place." Her colorless eyes reflected the firelight oddly, like a nocturnal animal's. "But you didn't come here for history lessons. You came seeking something." "I'm just hiking," I said, clearing my head. "Lying to me is useless, girl. I can hear the hollow whispering your secrets." Esther leaned forward, her face transformed by the flickering shadows. "You're running from failure, from shame, from the knowledge that everything you worked for was taken from you because they found out what you did." My blood turned to ice. There was no way she could know. No one knew except me and the company's legal team. "I don't know what you're talking about," I said, the words sounding hollow even to my own ears. "The data," Esther whispered, her voice suddenly sounding like multiple voices layered together. "The clinical trial results you altered. The patients who suffered because of your pride, your arrogance." She smiled that too wide smile again. "The hollow knows. It always knows." I stood abruptly, nearly stumbling backward. "You need to leave. Now." Esther remained seated, unnaturally still. "There's a price for what you did, Laura Adams. There's always a price. The hollow just helps collect it." "Get out of here," I said, raising the knife again. "Or I swear I'll—" "You'll what?" she interrupted, finally standing. Even at her full height, she was a small woman, at least 6 inches shorter than my 5'. yet somehow she seemed to loom over me. Kill an old woman. Add another sin to your ledger? I'm not listening to this, I said, backing toward my tent. Leave now, or I'm calling for help. I pulled my satellite phone from my pocket, a precaution I'd brought for emergencies. Esther laughed, a sound like dead leaves scraping across stone. No signal reaches the hollow after dark, but try if it makes you feel better. I powered on the phone, watching in dismay as it searched fruitlessly for a connection. I'd tested it that morning and had full satellite coverage. The hollow has its own rules, Esther said, taking a step toward me. Its own justice. I'm just its voice. Something in her tone snapped me out of my fear-induced paralysis. I'd dealt with manipulative people before. This was just an eccentric old woman trying to frighten me away from what she considered her territory. Look, I said firmly, I don't know who you are or how you know anything about me, but I'm not interested in your cryptic threats. I'll be gone in the morning, and you can have your hollow all to yourself. Esther's expression changed, the false friendliness dropping away like a discarded mask. Oh, you misunderstand. No one leaves the hollow without paying their debt, and yours, my dear, is quite substantial. Before I could respond, she moved with shocking speed, closing the distance between us in a blink. Her hand shot out, fingers wrapping around my wrist with impossible strength, forcing me to drop the knife. Her touch was wrong, cold and somehow slick, like wet stone rather than human flesh. Let go, I shouted, trying to pull away. The hollow is hungry, Esther whispered, her face inches from mine. It needs to feed, and you, with your guilty soul, will make a fine meal. With a strength born of panic, I wrenched free of her grip and stumbled backward. Without thinking, I grabbed a burning branch from the fire and thrust it toward her. Esther hissed, recoiling from the flames. In the brighter light, her face seemed to shift, the human features momentarily replaced by something angular and inhuman, all sharp planes and two wide eyes. I didn't wait to see more. I turned and ran, plunging into the darkness beyond my campsite, the burning branch held before me like a talisman. Behind me, I heard Esther's voice, now multi-toned and inhuman. Run, guilty one. The hollow knows every tree, every stone. There is no escape. I crashed through the underbrush, heedless of the branches whipping at my face and arms. My only thought was to put distance between myself and that thing that looked like an old woman but wasn't. The burning branch illuminated just enough of the path ahead to keep me from running headlong into trees, but it was rapidly burning down. I needed to find the trail again, to get out of this hollow before the light failed completely. After what felt like an eternity of panicked flight, I stumbled onto what appeared to be the main trail. Gasping for breath, I paused to orient myself. Which way led out of the hollow? In my fear, I'd lost all sense of direction. A twig snapped in the darkness behind me. Then another. I chose a direction and ran again, following the trail as it wound between towering trees and limestone outcroppings. The burning branch sputtered, the flames dying down to embers. Soon, I would be in complete darkness. As if in response to that thought, the moon emerged from behind clouds, casting a silvery light through gaps in the canopy. It wasn't much, but it was enough to see the trail. The sound of pursuit had faded, but I didn't slow down. My lungs burned, and a stitch clawed at my side, but terror kept me moving forward. The trail began to climb, giving me hope that I was indeed heading out of the hollow. If I could just reach higher ground by dawn, perhaps I would be beyond whatever influence controlled this place. As I rounded a bend in the trail, I came to an abrupt halt. There, blocking the path ahead, stood Esther Blackwood, or the thing that called itself by that name. She appeared exactly as she had at my campsite, showing no signs of having run through the forest. "Told you," she said, her voice now carrying harmonics that no human vocal cords could produce. "No escape." I backed away, looking frantically for another route. "The debt must be paid," Esther continued, gliding toward me with unnatural smoothness, her feet seeming to hover just above the ground. "The hollow will feed." "Stay back," I warned, holding out the now extinguished branch like a club. "I don't know what you are, but I'm not afraid of you." A lie, but I needed to hear myself say it. Esther laughed, the sound reverberating through the trees. "Your fear is delicious, but it's not what the hollow craves. It's the guilt that draws us, the shame, the secrets you hide from the world." She was close enough now that I could see her eyes had changed, the pale irises now glowing with an internal light, the pupils vertical slits like a cat's. "There's no point in running, Laura Adams. The hollow has chosen you. I have chosen you." Her voice dropped to that eerie, multi-toned whisper. "You falsified data. People died because of your ambition. Their blood stains your hands, invisible but indelible." "That's not true," I protested, though my voice wavered. "It was a mistake, an error in the spreadsheet. I didn't know until it was too late." "Lies," Esther hissed. "More lies to add to your burden." She stretched out one hand, the fingers too long, too flexible, beckoning. "Come with me willingly and your passage will be easier. Fight, and the hollow will take you anyway, but the pain will be exquisite." I glanced behind me, considering another attempt at flight, but there was nowhere to go. The trail was narrow here, with steep drops on either side. "What do you want from me?" I asked, playing for time, desperately trying to think of a way out. "Want?" Esther tilted her head at that unnatural angle again. "We want you, Laura Adams, your essence, your life force, your soul, if such things exist." Her lips peeled back from those two sharp teeth. "The hollow has been here since before humans walked these lands. It has always hungered. I have served it for a very long time." "What are you?" I whispered. "Once I was like you, human, flawed, guilty." Esther's form seemed to waver in the moonlight, becoming less solid. "Now I am the hollow's voice, its hands." She spread her elongated fingers. "Its teeth." She moved faster than my eyes could track, suddenly directly in front of me, those inhuman hands gripping my shoulders with painful force. Her face pressed close to mine, her breath smelling of damp earth and decay. "Your time in the world of men is over," she whispered. "The hollow claims you now." In that moment of absolute terror, something shifted within me. Perhaps it was survival instinct. Perhaps it was rage at the violation of having my deepest shame thrown in my face by this supernatural thing. Whatever the cause, I stopped retreating. "No," I said, the word emerging with surprising force. "You don't get to judge me. You don't get to decide my fate." I still held the extinguished branch. With all my strength, I swung it at Esther's head. To my shock, it connected, producing a sound like a rock hitting hollow wood. Esther stumbled backward, more in surprise than pain, her form flickering like a bad television signal. "You cannot fight the hollow," she snarled, her voice losing its human qualities entirely now, becoming a guttural growl that no human throat could produce. "Watch me," I replied, swinging the branch again. This time, Esther caught it, wrenching it from my grasp with impossible strength. She snapped it in two as if it were a twig, then tossed the pieces aside. "Enough games," she growled. "The hollow grows impatient." The air around her began to ripple, reality itself seeming to bend. Her form elongated, limbs stretching to impossible proportions, her dress melting into her skin, which darkened to the color of old bark. Her face lost its human features, becoming a twisted mask with those glowing eyes now dominating what had been Esther Blackwood. The creature that stood before me now bore little resemblance to an old woman. It was something ancient and alien, its body a twisted amalgamation of human and other, part tree, part insect, part something I had no reference for. "What we are is beyond your comprehension," it said in a voice that seemed to bypass my ears and speak directly into my mind. "What we will do to you is beyond your capacity to imagine." It reached for me with limbs that bent at impossible angles, ending in fingers like twisted roots. I should have been paralyzed with terror. Instead, a strange clarity descended over me. If this was how I would die, it would not be cowering and begging for mercy. I reached for my knife, only to remember I had dropped it back at the campsite. My backpack with all my gear was there too. I had nothing. No, that wasn't quite true. I had the satellite phone, still clutched in my left hand. Useless for calling for help, but a solid piece of technology that might serve as a weapon. The creature's twisted hands were inches from my face when I struck, driving the corner of the phone into one of those glowing eyes with all my strength. A shriek, like tearing metal, split the night. The creature recoiled, black ichor spurting from its damaged eye. Its form flickered more violently now, parts of it becoming transparent before solidifying again. I didn't wait to see more. I ducked past the thrashing creature and ran up the trail, pushing my exhausted body to its limits. Behind me, the shrieking continued, now interspersed with words in a language that hurt my ears. The trail grew steeper, my legs burning with the effort of the climb. The air seemed to thicken around me, making each breath a struggle. The forest itself appeared to be trying to stop me, vines whipping across the path, roots rising to trip my feet, branches reaching down like grasping hands. But I kept moving, driven by the certainty that to stop was to die. The shrieking behind me faded, replaced by an ominous silence that was somehow worse. I risked a glance over my shoulder and immediately wished I hadn't. The creature was following, not by running, but by flowing along the ground like living shadow, moving faster than any human could run. I turned back to the path ahead just in time to see it vanish. Where the trail had been, there was now only solid rock wall, as if the landscape itself had rearranged to trap me. I skidded to a halt, frantically looking for another way forward. To my left, the ground fell away in a steep slope studded with boulders. To my right, dense underbrush choked the space between tightly packed trees. The shadow thing was getting closer, its form re-solidifying as it approached, rising from the ground into that twisted parody of human shape. My options exhausted, I made the only choice available. I plunged into the underbrush to my right, pushing through thorny vines and dense foliage. Branches tore at my clothes and skin, but I barely felt the pain. Behind me, I heard the creature crash into the vegetation, its multiple limbs thrashing at the obstacles. I had one advantage in this desperate flight. My smaller human body could slip through gaps that the larger, misshapen creature had to tear through. It was stronger, but I was more agile. The underbrush suddenly opened onto another trail. Smaller, less defined, but definitely human-made. I didn't question this stroke of luck, just turned onto it and ran. The new path twisted and turned through the forest, sometimes so faint I feared I'd lost it. But it always reappeared, leading me ever upward, away from the hollow. The sound of pursuit grew more distant. Had I actually managed to outpace the creature? Or was this another trick, meant to lull me into a false sense of security? The trail crested a ridge, and suddenly I was out of the dense forest, standing on an outcropping of rock with a view of the surrounding wilderness. In the east, the first hint of dawn lightened the sky. I'd made it through the night. Gasping for breath, I turned to look back the way I had come. The forest below was shrouded in mist, whispering hollow a dark gash in the landscape. There was no sign of pursuit, but I didn't trust this apparent respite. I needed to keep moving, to put as much distance as possible between myself and that accursed place before nightfall. I followed the ridge trail as the sun rose, casting long shadows across the wilderness. By mid-morning, I had reached a fire tower marked on my map, a landmark I recognized. I knew where I was now, and more importantly, I knew how to get back to civilization. My satellite phone began to pick up a signal as I climbed the tower. With shaking hands, I called emergency services, reporting that I had become lost and needed assistance. I gave my location and was told that forest rangers would meet me at a nearby trailhead if I could make my way there. As I waited for rescue, sitting with my back against the tower's metal supports, I tried to make sense of what had happened in Whispering Hollow. Had I truly encountered some ancient entity, or had I experienced some kind of psychological break brought on by stress and isolation? The revelation about my professional disgrace had shaken me deeply. How could that thing have known about the spreadsheet error? About my desperate attempt to fix it before anyone noticed? About the cascade of consequences that followed? That wasn't public knowledge. It wasn't even in my personnel file. The company had kept it quiet to avoid scandal. Yet the Hollow had known. The Hollow whispers, Esther had said. Tells me things. The Rangers found me late that afternoon, dehydrated, exhausted, and covered in cuts and bruises but otherwise physically unharmed. They were professional and non-judgmental, attributing my wild story about a shape-shifting creature to confusion and possible heat exhaustion. I let them think that. What else could I do? The truth was too bizarre, too horrifying to share. They drove me back to my car at the tower trailhead, advising me to seek medical attention for my injuries and to be better prepared if I ever decided to hike in such remote areas again. I nodded, thanked them, and promised to be more careful in the future. I had no intention of ever setting foot in those woods again. The drive back to St. Louis was a blur. I checked into a hotel rather than returning to my empty apartment, needing the reassurance of other human beings nearby. After a long shower that couldn't quite wash away the feeling of uncleanliness that had settled into my pores, I collapsed into bed and fell into a deep, dreamless sleep. When I woke the next morning, sunlight streaming through the hotel curtains, I almost convinced myself that it had all been a nightmare. The cabin, Esther Blackwood, the twisted creature she had become. A stress-induced hallucination brought on by my recent professional disgrace and the isolation of the wilderness. Almost, but not quite. Because when I looked in the bathroom mirror, I saw that my eyes had changed. The warm brown I'd had all my life was now flecked with pale, almost colorless streaks. The same shade as Esther Blackwood's eyes before they had transformed into those glowing, inhuman orbs. And sometimes, in quiet moments, I can hear it, the whispering, faint but persistent, like the rustle of dry leaves or the murmur of distant voices, telling me things about the people around me, their secrets, their shames, their hidden guilts. It's getting louder each day. I find myself drawn to parks and wooded areas, to places where the boundary between the world of men and other places might be thinner. I catch myself studying maps of remote wilderness areas, my gaze always returning to Missouri, to the Ozarks, to Whispering Hollow. I write this as a warning. Though I know few will heed it, the Hollow is real. It hungers. And I fear that despite my escape, it has claimed some part of me after all. A seed planted in fertile soil, growing stronger with each passing day. Sometimes I wake in the night to find myself standing at my apartment window, looking out at the distant tree line visible on the horizon, my lips moving in words I don't remember speaking. The Hollow whispers. And now, God help me, I whisper back. If you're reading this and you've done something you can't forgive yourself for, some secret shame, some hidden guilt, stay away from Whispering Hollow. Stay away from the Ozarks altogether. The Hollow knows. It always knows. And it's always hungry. My name is Laura Adams, and I am 34 years old. This happened in the remote wilderness of Hercules Glades in Mark Twain National Forest, Missouri. And I fear it isn't over yet. My name is Jennifer Williams, and I am 31 years old. This happened in the Minnesauk Falls area of the St. Francois Mountains in Missouri just last summer. Looking back, I should have known better than to go alone. Every horror movie trope warns against it. The solitary hiker venturing into unfamiliar wilderness, inevitably encountering something terrible. But after Alex left, taking half our friends in the breakup and leaving me with an apartment full of memories I couldn't stand to face, I needed space. I needed wilderness. I needed to prove to myself that I could be alone and be okay. The Ozark Trail had always called to me, particularly the section near Minnesoc Falls, Missouri's highest waterfall. I'd hiked parts of it before, but always with others. With Alex, with our hiking group, with my brother when he visited from Colorado. Never alone. The thought both terrified and exhilarated me. A 3-day solo trek through one of Missouri's most beautiful and remote areas seemed like the perfect way to clear my head and reclaim my independence. I spent weeks planning, gathering supplies, studying maps, and reading trail reports. I even joined an online forum for women who hike solo, absorbing their advice and safety tips. By the time I set out that Friday morning in late July, my backpack was meticulously packed with everything I could possibly need, and my route was carefully plotted. "You're sure about this?" My brother's concern was evident even over the phone as I drove toward the trailhead. "That's grizzly country, Jen. It's Missouri, not Montana," I laughed. "No grizzlies here. Maybe some black bears, but they're shy. I've got bear spray and I know what to do." I didn't tell him about the small canister of pepper spray I also carried, more for 2-legged predators than 4-legged ones. As a woman hiking alone, I wasn't naive about the potential dangers. "Just stay on the marked trails," he urged, "and keep your satellite messenger handy." I promised I would, then ended the call as I pulled into the small parking area at the Tomsock Mountain trailhead. There were a few other cars, a good sign that I wouldn't be completely alone in the wilderness, but not so many that the trails would be crowded. The air was thick with summer heat as I shouldered my pack and set off, the weight already familiar and almost comforting. The initial part of the trail was well maintained and relatively easy, winding through dense oak and hickory forest. Dappled sunlight filtered through the canopy, creating shifting patterns on the rocky path. I felt the tension of the past months begin to loosen its grip on my chest. By late afternoon, I'd covered about 7 miles and was approaching Minnesoc Falls. The sound reached me before the sight, the soft roar of water cascading over rock. The falls weren't at their most impressive in midsummer. Spring rains would have created a more dramatic flow. Still, as I rounded the bend and caught my first glimpse, I wasn't disappointed. The water descended in a series of drops over ancient rhyolite, creating a stepped waterfall that ended in a clear pool before continuing as a stream down the mountain. The late afternoon sun caught the spray, painting a faint rainbow against the reddish rock. I stopped to take photos, then consulted my map. My planned campsite was about a mile further along the trail, at a spot where previous hikers had reported a level clearing with a fire ring, not far from the stream that flowed from the falls. As I continued hiking, I noticed a subtle change in the forest. The trees grew closer together, their trunks gnarled and twisted in ways that seemed almost deliberate. The undergrowth thickened, brambles and vines reaching across the path as if trying to reclaim it. The bird calls that had accompanied me all day gradually faded, replaced by a heavy silence broken only by my footsteps and the distant murmur of the stream. I blamed my unease on fatigue and pushed forward, relieved when I finally spotted the clearing mentioned in the trail reports. It was as described, a relatively flat area about 30 feet in diameter with a crude fire ring of stacked stones at its center. The stream gurgled nearby, providing a constant white noise that I knew would lull me to sleep later. Setting up camp was a welcome distraction from the strange atmosphere of the forest. I pitched my tent, collected water from the stream to filter, and gathered fallen branches for a small fire. The physical activity grounded me, pushing away the vague anxiety that had been building since I'd passed the falls. As dusk approached, I got my first fire of the trip going, its warm light creating a circle of safety in the gathering darkness. I heated water for my freeze-dried meal, then sat cross-legged by the fire to eat and review my map for the next day's hike. That's when I noticed the carvings. They were subtle, easy to miss in daylight, but now caught in the dramatic shadows cast by my fire. The trees surrounding my campsite were marked with symbols, crude pictographs etched into the bark at about eye level. A spiral, a stick figure with too many limbs, what looked like an eye with a vertical pupil. I told myself they were just trail markers, perhaps left by previous hikers, or maybe the work of local kids who hiked up from nearby towns to party in the woods. The alternative, that they might be something older, something with purpose, was not a thought I wanted to entertain as night fell in an unfamiliar forest. As I was pondering the markings, a twig snapped in the darkness beyond my firelight. I jerked upright, hand automatically reaching for the pepper spray in my pocket. "Hello," I called, trying to keep my voice steady. "Someone there?" No response, but I had the distinct impression of being watched. The feeling crawled across my skin like insects, raising goosebumps despite the summer warmth. I fed more wood to the fire, building it higher than was strictly necessary. The enlarged circle of light revealed nothing unusual among the trees, yet did nothing to dispel my unease. I considered packing up and hiking back to my car by headlamp, but quickly dismissed the idea. Night hiking on an unfamiliar trail was far more dangerous than whatever imagined threat had spooked me. Besides, I'd come here partly to prove to myself that I could handle being alone. Running away at the first sign of discomfort would defeat the purpose. Instead, I took out my journal and began to write, detailing my journey so far and my plans for the next day. The familiar activity calmed me, and eventually, the weight of the day's hike caught up with me. I banked the fire, made sure my food was properly secured in a bear bag hung from a tree branch away from my tent, and crawled into my sleeping bag. Despite my exhaustion, sleep didn't come easily. Every rustle of leaves, every creak of branches in the light breeze seemed magnified in the darkness. I lay awake, staring at the roof of my tent, illuminated occasionally by the dying embers of my fire. When I finally drifted off, my dreams were fragmented and unsettling. Images of twisted trees reaching with branch fingers, of symbols carved into bark that seemed to writhe and change when viewed directly, of eyes watching from shadows too deep for light to penetrate. I woke suddenly, heart pounding, though I couldn't immediately identify what had disturbed my sleep. The fire had died completely, leaving only the faint moonlight filtering through the trees to illuminate my surroundings. My watch read 2:17 a.m. Then I heard it, a voice calling from somewhere in the forest. "Hello? Is anyone there? I need help." It was a woman's voice, high with panic or pain. Without thinking, I unzipped my tent and scrambled out, grabbing my headlamp. "Hello," I called back. "Where are you?" "Here. I'm over here. Please, I've fallen. I think my leg is broken." The voice seemed to come from the direction of the stream, maybe 100 yards from my campsite. I hesitated only briefly before pulling on my hiking boots and jacket. Someone was hurt. I couldn't just ignore their calls for help, even if venturing into the forest at night went against every survival instinct I possessed. I clicked on my headlamp, grabbed my first aid kit and phone, though I already knew there would be no service, and headed in the direction of the voice. "Keep talking," I shouted. "I'm coming to help. Hurry, please. I'm so cold." The night forest was an entirely different world from its daytime counterpart. My headlamp created a narrow tunnel of visibility, beyond which absolute darkness pressed in from all sides. The familiar trail quickly disappeared as I followed the voice away from my campsite, forcing me to navigate around trees and over fallen logs, always moving toward that desperate call. "I'm getting closer," I called out. "Are you near the water?" "Yes, by the big rock. Please hurry." I could hear the stream now, louder than it had been at my campsite. The voice was guiding me downstream, toward what I assumed would be a larger pool, or perhaps even back toward the falls. After about 10 minutes of careful progress through the dark woods, I emerged at the edge of a small clearing. My headlamp illuminated a pool where the stream widened and deepened before continuing down the mountain. A large, flat rock jutted out over the water, but there was no injured hiker. "Hello," I called, turning in a slow circle, light scanning the clearing. "I'm here to help." "Where are you?" No response. The forest had gone completely silent. No insects, no night birds, not even the rustling of leaves, though I could feel a breeze on my face. A sense of wrongness settled over me like a physical weight. I took an involuntary step backward, suddenly desperate to return to the relative safety of my tent. "Hello? Please, I'm down here." The voice came from directly below the rock that overhung the pool. I approached cautiously, leaning out to direct my light toward the sound. The beam reflected off the black water, creating distorted patterns that seemed to move independently of the gentle current. For a moment, I thought I saw a face in those patterns, not reflected from above but looking up from below the surface. A woman's face, pale and drawn, with eyes too large and too dark for a human countenance. I jerked back just as a hand, bone-white and impossibly elongated, reached up from the water, grasping at the spot where I'd been standing moments before. I didn't wait to see more. I turned and ran, crashing through underbrush, branches whipping my face and catching on my clothes. Behind me, I heard something emerge from the water. A wet, heavy sound followed by footsteps. Not the labored steps of an injured hiker, but quick, pursuing strides that seemed to gain on me with unnatural speed. Jennifer. Wait. My name. It knew my name. But I'd never introduced myself, never even spoken my name aloud since entering the forest. Terror gave me speed I didn't know I possessed. I sprinted blindly through the trees, my headlamp bouncing wildly, creating a chaotic strobe of illumination that made navigation nearly impossible. I had no idea if I was heading toward my campsite or deeper into the wilderness. The footsteps behind me never faltered, maintaining a steady pace that would overtake me eventually. I needed to hide or find my way back to my tent, where I had my satellite messenger and could at least call for help. I veered left, hoping to circle back toward my camp, and found myself faced with a steep slope. Without slowing, I began to climb, using tree roots and rocks as handholds. The pursuit paused briefly at the base of the incline, as if considering options, then began to follow, moving with a spider-like agility that sent fresh waves of terror through me. At the top of the slope, I emerged onto what appeared to be a trail, not the main Ozark Trail, but a narrower path, less maintained but clearly defined. Without hesitation, I turned right and continued running, lungs burning, legs beginning to tremble with exhaustion. The trail twisted through the forest, gradually widening until I realized with a surge of relief that I recognized my surroundings. I was approaching my campsite from the opposite direction I'd left it. I burst into the clearing, immediately spotting my tent, the dark outline of my bear bag hanging from a distant branch, the cold remnants of my fire. I headed straight for the tent, desperate to reach my satellite messenger. As I crossed the campsite, my headlamp swept across the trees surrounding the clearing. The symbols I'd noticed earlier seemed to have multiplied, now covering every trunk in a chaotic jumble of carvings. And they were bleeding. A thick, dark substance oozed from each symbol, running down the bark like sap or blood. I tore my eyes away and scrambled into my tent, frantically digging through my pack for the messenger. My fingers closed around it just as I heard movement at the edge of the clearing. Jennifer. The voice was different now, still feminine but distorted, as if speaking through water or thick mud. I risked a glance out of my tent and immediately wished I hadn't. A figure stood at the tree line, illuminated dimly by my headlamp. It had the general shape of a woman but was wrong in every detail. Too tall, too thin, with limbs that bent at impossible angles. Its skin had the pallor of something that lived underwater, slick and glistening in the artificial light. Black hair hung in wet ropes around a face that was almost but not quite human. The eyes too large, the mouth too wide and filled with needle-like teeth. It took a step toward my tent, moving with a jerky, unsettling gait. "You shouldn't be alone in these woods, Jennifer Williams." It tilted its head at an unnatural angle, that too wide mouth stretching into what might have been meant as a smile. "No one should be alone here. But now, you won't be. Now, you'll join us." My fingers fumbled with the satellite messenger, sending an SOS signal with my location. It wouldn't bring help in time, but it was all I could do. The creature took another step forward, and I noticed for the first time that it left wet footprints that seemed to glow faintly with a bluish phosphorescence. The same glow was visible beneath its skin, pulsing like a heartbeat through distended veins. "What do you want?" I managed to ask, my voice barely a whisper. It cocked its head further, neck bending at an angle that should have been physically impossible. "Want? We want company. We want to share what we found in the deep places beneath the mountain." It gestured toward the distant falls with one elongated arm. So many secrets down there. So many changes waiting to happen. It was close enough now that I could smell it. A dank, rotting odor of stagnant water and decaying vegetation. I backed further into my tent, though the thin fabric offered no real protection. The others who came before you fought or ran. It made a wet sound that might have been laughter, but in the end, they all joined us in the hollow beneath the falls. Your kind can't help but answer when we call. So curious, so helpful. My mind raced, trying to process what I was hearing while simultaneously searching for any possible escape. The creature blocked the most direct route to the trail, but if I could get past it and reach the main path, maybe I could outdistance it. Make it to the parking lot, to my car. As if reading my thoughts, it shook its head. "The waters connect everything beneath the mountain. We'll find you wherever you run. Better to accept, better to join willingly." Join what? What are you? We were like you once. Hikers, explorers, curious about what lay beneath the falls behind the cascades, in the darkness of the underground river. It raised one hand, webbed fingers spreading wide. Then we found the deep pool, the one that glows like foxfire, the one that changes those who drink from it. Its head swiveled toward the direction of the falls, the one that gave us new purpose. A memory surfaced, a news article from a few years back about hikers gone missing in this region. The search had centered around Minasoc Falls, but no bodies were ever found. The prevailing theory had been that they were swept away by unexpectedly strong currents after heavy rain. The creature took another step forward, now just feet from my tent. "Let me show you," it said, extending one elongated hand toward me. "Let me take you to the hollow beneath the falls. You'll understand once you drink the waters." I didn't want to understand. I wanted to be anywhere but here. With sudden decision, I lunged for my backpack, grabbing the bear spray I'd packed as a precaution. The creature's reflexes were inhumanly fast. It reached for me with those webbed hands, fingertips brushing my sleeve as I scrambled backward. I aimed the canister and pressed the trigger, sending a cloud of capsaicin directly into its face. The effect was instantaneous and horrifying. The creature recoiled with a shriek that sounded like metal grinding against metal. Its hands flew to its face, fingers digging into the flesh around its oversized eyes. Where the spray had made contact, its skin seemed to bubble and dissolve, revealing a luminescent blue substance beneath that hissed and steamed upon exposure to air. I didn't wait to see more. I burst from the tent, sprinting toward the trail with nothing but the clothes on my back, the bear spray still clutched in my hand, and my headlamp bouncing wildly around my neck. Behind me, the creature's shrieks changed tone, becoming a gurgling howl that was answered by similar cries from deeper in the forest, from the direction of the falls. There were more of them. Many more, judging by the chorus of inhuman voices that now rose through the night. I ran like I'd never run before, feet pounding against the trail, lungs burning, muscles screaming in protest. The main trail was wider, easier to follow even in the erratic light of my headlamp. I silently thanked my past self for studying the maps so thoroughly. I knew exactly how far it was to the parking lot. 2 miles. I could cover that in 20 minutes at a dead run, if they didn't catch me first. I could hear them in the forest on either side of the trail, crashing through undergrowth, that wet, slapping sound of their feet against the earth. They were paralleling my course, perhaps hoping to cut me off ahead. The trail began to climb, and my pace slowed inevitably. My breath came in ragged gasps, and a stitch stabbed at my side. I couldn't maintain this speed much longer. As if sensing my fatigue, the pursuit closed in. A figure darted across the trail ahead, similar to the first creature but smaller, moving with the same unsettling gait, leaving those phosphorescent footprints that glowed briefly before fading. I skidded to a halt, then veered off the trail to the right, hoping to circle around the ambush. The forest was denser here, harder to navigate, but I pushed through, desperation giving me strength I didn't know I possessed. A root caught my foot, sending me sprawling. I landed hard, the impact driving the air from my lungs. The bear spray flew from my grasp, disappearing into the underbrush. For a moment, I lay stunned, unable to move, unable to breathe. Then survival instinct took over. I pushed myself up, ignoring the pain in my chest and the warm trickle of blood from a cut on my forehead. My headlamp had twisted around during the fall and now illuminated the forest behind me. In its beam, I could see them. 3 figures moving through the trees with that same jerky, inhuman gait. Their skin glistened wetly, and their 2 large eyes reflected the light like those of nocturnal animals. I scrambled to my feet and started running again, readjusting my headlamp as I moved. The trail couldn't be far, if I could just reach it, follow it back to the parking lot. There. Through the trees, I caught a glimpse of the wider path. I angled toward it, pushing through the last of the underbrush and emerged onto the main trail once more, only to find myself face to face with another of the creatures. This one was different from the first, male in its general form, with broader shoulders and a more angular face, but it shared the same pallid skin, elongated limbs, and phosphorescent veins. It wore the tattered remains of what might once have been hiking clothes, now little more than rags clinging to its transformed body. "No more running," it said, its voice a bubbling whisper. "The Hollow calls you now." Behind me, I could hear the others approaching, closing in from the forest. I was surrounded. The creature before me reached out, those webbed fingers extending toward my face. I stepped backward, knowing there was nowhere left to run but unable to simply surrender. My heel caught on something. A rock, a root, and I began to fall. The creature lunged forward, seizing my arm in a grip that was inhumanly strong and ice-cold. I struggled against it, but its fingers only tightened, digging into my flesh. "The water will embrace you," it hissed, its face inches from mine. "The Hollow will become your home." In my peripheral vision, I saw the others emerge from the forest, forming a loose circle around us. They swayed slightly, as if to some unheard rhythm, their eyes fixed on me with hungry anticipation. The creature began to pull me toward the direction of the falls, toward whatever hollow they had emerged from. I fought with every ounce of strength I had left, but it was like struggling against stone. And then, without warning, light flooded the forest. Bright, artificial light that swept across the scene like a physical force. The creatures froze, their oversized eyes widening further in what looked like pain or fear. "Park Ranger, stop right there." The voice boomed through the night, amplified by what sounded like a megaphone. The light came again, even brighter this time, and I realized it was a powerful spotlight sweeping the trail. The creature holding me hissed, its grip loosening just enough for me to wrench free. I stumbled away, toward the source of the light and voice. The creatures were retreating now, melting back into the forest with unnatural speed. Within seconds, they had vanished into the darkness, leaving only those faintly glowing footprints that were already beginning to fade. I ran toward the light, nearly collapsing with relief when I made out the uniform of a park ranger. He was a solid presence in the night, shotgun in one hand, spotlight in the other. "Are you Jennifer Williams?" he asked as I approached. "We received an SOS from your satellite messenger." I nodded, unable to speak, tears of relief and lingering terror streaming down my face. "Let's get you out of here," he said, gently taking my arm, his touch warm and human and safe. "My vehicle's just up the trail." As he led me away, I glanced back over my shoulder. For just a moment I thought I saw pale faces watching from between the trees, their oversized eyes reflecting the retreating light of the ranger's spotlight. They were everywhere, I managed to say as we walked. They came out of the water from beneath the falls. They wanted to take me there to make me like them. The ranger's grip on my arm tightened slightly. "You're safe now," he said, but there was something in his voice, a tension, a knowledge, that made me look up at his face. "You know," I whispered, "you know about them." He didn't answer immediately, just kept walking, guiding me up the trail. Finally, as the trees began to thin and I could make out the silhouette of a ranger vehicle ahead, he spoke. "There are places in these mountains that aren't on any map," he said quietly. "Places the water goes underground and comes back changed. Places people go missing." He glanced down at me. "We find some of them eventually, or what's left of them. Others—" He didn't need to finish the thought. I had seen what happened to the others. "How long has this been happening?" I asked. "Longer than the Park Service has existed. Longer than European settlement." We had reached his vehicle now, and he opened the passenger door for me. "The indigenous people who lived here called this place the Hollowing Ground. They never came here after dark, especially not near the water." I climbed into the vehicle, the normality of bucket seats and dashboard instruments surreal after what I'd just experienced. The ranger circled around and got in the driver's side. "We try to monitor the area, especially after dark," he continued as he started the engine. "But the park is big and there aren't many of us, and most of what we know is pieced together from the few who've encountered them and survived, like you." "Will they come after me?" The question had been forming in my mind since our escape. "They knew my name. They found my campsite." The ranger was quiet for a long moment as we drove along the narrow park road. "I don't know," he finally admitted. "Some survivors report dreams, voices calling them back to the water. Others never experience anything unusual again." He glanced at me. "But I wouldn't hike alone in these parts anymore. Not at night. Probably not during the day either." I nodded, knowing I would never return to this forest, no matter how much time passed. When we reached the parking lot, my car sat alone under the security light, looking impossibly normal and safe. The ranger waited while I found my spare key, hidden magnetically under the rear bumper, then followed me home to make sure I arrived safely. Before he left, he gave me his card. "If you experience anything unusual, dreams, voices, the feeling of being watched, call me. Immediately. Day or night." I thanked him, took the card, and watched as he drove away, the taillights of his vehicle disappearing around a curve in the road. That was 3 months ago. I've since moved from Missouri to Colorado near my brother. I told him a sanitized version of events, that I got lost, panicked, and was rescued by a park ranger. He was just relieved I was safe. I've mostly convinced myself that what happened that night was some kind of hallucination brought on by isolation, exhaustion, and fear. Almost convinced. But sometimes when I'm drifting off to sleep, I hear it, that wet, bubbling voice calling my name from very far away. And in my dreams, I see the hollow beneath the falls, a cavern glowing with the same phosphorescent blue that pulsed beneath their skin. They're waiting for me there, those transformed hikers, waiting in the darkness beneath the mountain, waiting for me to answer their call and return to Minnesota. And the most terrifying part? Sometimes I want to.